Order.
O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Good afternoon, members. Minister's statement. Minister, question. Good day, and the Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the employees of the Government of the Northwest Territories are dedicated to the work that they do and are committed to the success of their communities. Hundreds of employees spend countless hours giving back to their communities through volunteer work during their personal time. Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this moment to recognize all of the employees who volunteer in their communities. How we take care of one another is what shapes the character of our communities and what makes the North unique and special. In addition to their volunteer time, every year, employees have the option to have donations for United Way N.W.T. automatically deducted from their paychecks. Last year, employees contributed $150,000 to the United Way N.W.T. through this campaign, which I am honoured to co-chair with the Union of Northern Workers President, Mr. Todd Parsons. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow marks the start of the 2018 United Way N.W.T. Employee Giving Campaign. The United Way N.W.T. is a not-for-profit organization committed to building strong and healthy northern communities. Its role is to match community resources through these payroll contributions and to help get those funds to our territory's areas of greatest need. In many ways, the Government of the Northwest Territories and the United Way N.W.T. share the same goals. We want to improve the lives of our people, build stronger communities, and create positive social change for the residents of our territory. The United Way N.W.T. ensures that employee contributions stay in the territory and contribute directly to our residents and communities. Every day, employees work to build a better territory. They show this commitment in their work, but also in their generosity through our workplace campaign. Through the employee payroll plan, employees, including myself and many of the people in this room, are doing their part to create caring communities by contributing to the United Way N.W.T. and in the organizations that they support. Some of the organizations who have benefited from contributions from employees include the Inuvik Youth Centre, Dene Naho, the Hay River Soup Kitchen, the Rainbow Coalition, N.W.T. Breast Health, Children's First Society, and the list goes on. Mr. Speaker, to put the power of this collective effort into context, one employee's payroll contributions of 50 cents per workday was able to feed over 50 people at the Hay River Soup Kitchen in 1 month. A $2 per workday contribution of another employee allowed Yellowknife Cares to create weekend meal kits for 30 children in need. Investing in the health and well-being of our people and communities and building prosperity in the Northwest Territories are priorities of the United Way N.W.T. and the mandate of this government. These goals are shared by many non-governmental organizations in our territory and by our employees. United Way N.W.T. is working to achieve these goals through investment in 3 areas of focus: which are From Poverty to Possibility, Healthy People, Strong Communities, and All That Kids Can Be. Next year, the United Way N.W.T. is investing $170,000 to support nonprofits in our territory to improve lives and build community in these three areas. Mr. Speaker, I commend the efforts of United Way N.W.T. and their board and volunteers for all their hard work as they continue to make a positive impact on the lives of many of our residents in need. Furthermore, I would like to thank the Government of the Northwest Territories employees for their continued generosity, which is making it possible for the United Way N.W.T. and our communities to achieve great success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statement. Minister Ike Godani, the Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories made a commitment in its mandate to ensure the effective supports and programs are available for persons with disabilities. Our government believes that every person living with a disability has the full right to citizenship and opportunity, which is why we've been working with our partners and stakeholders to advance plans that will effectively guide our efforts to support this goal. In March 2016, our government initiated the Disability Program Review and Renewal Project to look at the status of current services and identify gaps and opportunities for improvements through the development of a new strategic framework, programs and services inventory and action plan. Mr. Speaker, in February 2018, we released the Equity, Accessibility and Inclusion and Participation, the N.W.T. Disability Strategic Framework 2017 to 2027. Disability Matters, a companion to the N.W.T. Disability Strategic Framework and the N.W.T. Programs and Services for Persons with Disabilities Inventory. Our action plan, which will be tabled later today, builds on the priorities established within the N.W.T. Disability Strategic Framework to ensure our work supports outcomes that the persons and family-centered, supports inclusion and accessibility, promotes and supports awareness, education and training, and ensures a timely coordination, evaluation, and reporting. The action plan represents a shared vision and partnership between the Departments of Health and Social Services, Education, Culture and Employment, Justice, Finance, Municipal and Community Affairs, Infrastructure, and the N.W.T. Housing Corporation. Mr. Speaker, this work was guided by the results of extensive engagement with our non-government organization partners in the disability sector. Our partners provided valuable input as to what is needed to support persons with disabilities and their families. We will continue to engage with them to ensure that our actions are meeting their intended outcomes for persons with disabilities. We know that there is a growing demand on disability services driven by an increased incidence of physical and cognitive disabilities, a growing seniors population, increased rates of disability associated with aging, and the need for caregiver supports. We want to improve the lives of N.W.T. residents with disabilities by focusing on 5 objectives: increasing income security and reducing poverty, building awareness and knowledge through education and training, improving transition planning and options, encouraging universal design and living options, and improving access and quality of caregiver supports. The action plan will help our government pursue new avenues and resources available to promote more equity, accessibility, and inclusion, and help us support the participation in all aspects of economic and social life of persons with disabilities in the Northwest Territories. We will be accountable to persons with disabilities and all residents on the progress of this action plan. Each department will report on the status of their action items, and the Department of Health and Social Services will coordinate and monitor the reporting of the individual actions within it. I want to thank all of my colleagues and the department staff for supporting our government-wide approach to improving services and programs for persons with disabilities. I also want to thank our disability NGO partners, including the N.W.T. Disabilities Council, Yellowknife Association for Community Living, the N.W.T. Senior Society, Hay River Community for Persons with Disabilities, and the N.W.T. Foster Family Coalition for their input and their support. It will require that we all continue to work together in order to deliver on action items. We are looking forward to implementing the N.W.T. Disability Action Plan, which will guide the work required to advance our vision to make the N.W.T. an inclusive and accessible territory. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister's statement. Minister, you can go down in the Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise members that the Honourable Wally Schuman will be absent from the House for the remainder of this week to attend both the Federal Provincial Territorial Ministers of Internal Trade and the Federal Provincial Territorial Ministers of Innovation and Economic Development meetings in Vancouver, British Columbia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I wept when the Office of the Auditor General reviewed its latest findings of the Child and Family Services audit. They concluded for the second time in 4 years that Child and Family Services is failing children in care, not just failing them, but sometimes putting them at risk of even greater harm than the circumstances that brought them into care in the first place. A child has been assaulted, another was missing from a treatment program. For example, health authorities must investigate a report of a child in a potentially unsafe situation within 30 days. The auditor found that a quarter of these investigations weren't completed on time. In a third of investigations, the required interview with parents, the child, and others with information didn't happen. In 3/4 of cases, long-term risks weren't assessed. All of these indicators have increased since the last audit 4 years ago. Mr. Speaker, I believe that everyone involved in the lives of children in care wants them to be safe. The problem isn't intention, it's resources. The auditor found that the authorities are overburdened with changes that were not well resourced and which help produce worse results. It is clear that the focus needs to be on the children themselves rather than on the systems that manage their circumstances. A key recommendation in this audit is that the Department of Health and Social Services and the health authorities must perform a detailed assessment of the financial and human resources to deliver child and family services. The same recommendation was made 4 years ago and by Cindy Blackstock in her review of Child and Family Services in 2009 and by the Child Welfare League of Canada 18 years ago. Until this work is done, we won't know why Yellowknife has twice as many child protection workers as the Clecho Community Services Agency when the size of their caseload is similar. The department's response to most of the recent recommendations focuses on things like team design and streamlining business processes. My fear is that children will again be pushed further to the margins while the department prioritizes its systems and ensures its liability is covered. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health and Social Services was a member of the standing committee that hired Ms. Blackstock, and he has been the Health Minister for 7 years. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Massey. Member statements like nada ita sadze suha tane kadion ami kani wole. Matige kani wo member Yellowknife Centre sadze no gion.
Mr. Speaker, Massey colleagues. Mr. Speaker, that means the Minister has heard this call to identify the resources needed to provide these services at least 3 times. And the problems not only persist, they are getting worse. The children who needed his help 9 years ago are now adults or well on their way. It's worth remembering that these children, all children, have but one childhood. Our priority must be to help children not only survive it, but to thrive in safe and in supportive environments. Massey.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Goodden and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. The recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we are already seeing the consequences of a 1 degree Celsius increase in global warming. There's more extreme weather, diminishing Arctic sea ice, among other changes. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require, quote, rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, end of quote. 91 authors and review editors from 40 countries prepared the report with more than 6,000 scientific references cited. The good news is that some of the kinds of actions that we would need to take to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius are already underway around the world, but they need to accelerate. On May 24th, I urged the federal government to reject Cabinet's climate change plan. This was based on the unrealistic 44% greenhouse gas reductions from the expansion of Tulsa Hydro, the back-end loading of emission reductions, misdirection of efforts on electricity production rather than motivating large industrial emitters, and a failure to address the leadership deficiencies noted in the Auditor General's report on N.W.T. climate change. The Cabinet response to the committee review of this audit, tabled earlier this sitting, fails again to adopt any changes in accountability or authority to ensure that there is adequate climate change leadership. Cabinet's approach on climate change falls far short of how we need to respond to the IPCC imperative of far-reaching and unprecedented changes. The Minister of Finance finally announced Cabinet's approach to carbon pricing in July. While individuals and families will get some of the carbon tax back through the adjustments to the cost of living allowance and child benefit, industry, the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, can actually get all of the carbon tax back that they pay. It will be individuals, families, and small businesses that will subsidize the N.W.T initiatives under the energy strategy, not the largest emitters, which include the diamond mines. This hardly seems fair or balanced. The Minister of Finance has been silent on the issue of how the carbon tax will be managed and accounted for. It's not clear whether the reporting will try to link carbon tax funds collected with investments into renewables and any reductions in greenhouse gas reductions. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Member Nadait, Salzasu ha the neck carry on the Amik animal. Member Nadant Sazinogion, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to my colleagues. A real carbon pricing system for the N.W.T can help us in fighting the climate change emergency that faces us. We must pursue legislative and policy changes to ensure climate change leadership and an energy strategy built on renewables that doesn't masquerade as an infrastructure funding demand. As other regular members have indicated, I cannot support Cabinet's carbon tax and climate change plan. The federal government's backstop approach on carbon pricing is starting to look a lot better. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the Member Kamlik.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, a young Indigenous woman went into Stanton Territorial Hospital complaining of extreme pain. The pain was so bad that in the emergency room, she doubled over in agony and was curled up in the fetal position crying. It was then a nurse told this young woman that she was being dramatic before calling a security guard over to force the woman to stand up. Medical records reveal staff indicated her unnecessarily hyperventilating and dramatically yelling. Only after this humiliation was the young woman diagnosed with 8.3 millimeter kidney stones as well as strep throat. Mr. Speaker, this experience was shared with me by one of my constituents, but sadly, she's not alone in her encounters with cultural bias in the N.W.T healthcare system. Indigenous residents from across the N.W.T have raised similar concerns and shared similar horror stories. Only this morning I heard tell of a common treatment prescribed to Indigenous patients complaining of illness in the smallest of our communities. Take an aspirin and the problem will go away, leading to some to call it the magic pill, used as a catch-all for any medical issue raised in the community. We as a government have an obligation to ensure the healthcare system and all government services are free from prejudice, racism, or bias. It's disheartening to hear about the instances of misdiagnosis and neglect. All too often, Indigenous peoples are labeled as intoxicated, which is, yes, symptomatic of alcohol consumption. However, the symptom is shared with the following medical conditions: diabetes, hypoglycemia, epilepsy, brain injury, Alzheimer's, Wilson's disease, multiple sclerosis, stroke, hypothermia, and hypoxia, just to name a few, Mr. Speaker. Misdiagnosing these patients due to their cultural background is an example of what researchers call implicit or unconscious racism, rather than intentional racism. We must avoid the factors that ensure these problems continue from generation to generation. Breaking the cycle of racial and cultural bias is the best path forward, and we can do it together. We must ensure that frontline government workers have appropriate training, not triage nor to diagnose, but to be aware of the complexity of symptoms and the full range of possible causes, as opposed to jumping on our own deeply held preconception and bias. In June of this year, the Honourable Minister of Health and Service agreed with these concerns and promised that changes are coming to the public healthcare system in the N.W.T, including cultural training for healthcare workers that was slated to begin this fall. Mr. Speaker, I want to believe this government is taking the actions to fix this problem, and I will be asking the Minister of Health and Social Services to help me believe. Thank you.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godani, Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to share a good news success story. It's a story of collaboration between government, the private sector, and nonprofit groups. It benefits many sectors: tourism, education, recreation, mining and culture, and notably, it didn't need structure, process, or even regulation. Mr. Speaker, in the 1930s, prospectors came north seeking gold. One of them was Winslow Rainey. In his search, he opened what became known as the Rainy Hill Trail, just a little bit north of here. Years later, as gold mines closed and Yellowknife became a government town, exploration trails were adapted for recreation. The Rainy Hill Trail became known for its excellent examples of geology that built Yellowknife. In 2013, TerraX Minerals acquired the area as part of its ongoing Yellowknife City Gold Project. Later, TerraX partnered with ITI, the N.W.T Geological Survey, and Mine Training Society to offer a prospecting course on the Rainy Hill Geological Interpretive Trail. The course offers people from around the territory their prospecting license, and it sells out every year. In 2017, a working group was established to consider ways different groups could use the trail. It was led by N.W.T Parks and Recreation Association and included ITI's Tourism and Minerals Directorate, TerraX, and the N.W.T Geological Survey. They funded independent consultations and studies for uses of the trail. This past summer, the Mine Training Society led the implementation plan, and new partners joined the team. 50 directional signposts were installed, disorienting flagging was removed, parking at the trailhead was expanded, and the trail surface was maintained. Most of the work was done by volunteers from recreational groups. Next year's plan includes boardwalks to protect wet areas, benches and interpretive signage, and an interpretive phone app will be launched. Mr. Speaker, now this trail is easily accessible to families, students, and tourists. It's becoming increasingly popular with youth groups and tour operators. Mr. Speaker, the evolution of this trail facility is a great example of what can be achieved through collaboration. Many different community groups now have a facility that serves their specific needs, all without complex administration or bureaucracy. I'd like to express my appreciation to all the groups, organizations, and individuals who contributed their time and energy to this valuable community project. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godani, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, public housing tenants in my riding are troubled by changes in their power bills. For a bit of background, the N.W.T Housing Corporation is in the third phase of its mandate commitment to develop options to rationalize public housing utility pricing structures to promote self-reliance. Over the past 3 years, the Housing Corporation has been slowly reducing its subsidy of power rates for public housing tenants. The government's goal is to increase energy conservation and tenant self-reliance and to conserve corporation funds, all through bringing tenants' power rates in line with power rates of other residents. Mr. Speaker, these are good goals. Still, I'm troubled by the way this has all rolled out. Change is never easy, and when change means higher power bills for low-income tenants, many of whom are already on income support, there's going to be confusion, worry, and distress. Some of my constituents haven't been sure how much their power bills will go up or how it might affect their ability to pay other things they need, like food, clothing, gas, and other items for themselves and their families. And there's another wrinkle. Tenants using income support programs are wondering how income assistance will adapt to these new costs. I know that this is something that the Housing Corporation has been working on for a while now, but to bring this initiative to the finish line, Mr. Speaker, there are questions that still need to be answered, and clear and open communication with affected tenants will be critical. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have questions later today.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member N.W.T.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I would like to speak on two ideas I have for post-secondary students in the N.W.T. On February 7th and again on May 31st, 2018, I made member statements to the idea of turning the old Stanton Territorial Hospital into a nursing school as it transitions into a long-term care facility for seniors. Mr. Speaker, this idea is still relevant today and remains to be an idea which contains a lot of potential for the N.W.T. This is also an idea where I get more and more positive feedback as I talk about it. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, today I would like to reiterate some previous comments I made on this topic, as well as some new ideas I'd like to share on expanding post-secondary education in the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, creating a nursing school in N.W.T. has all the ingredients needed to foster employment across our territory. This would happen because we would create a facility which houses long-term care patients and will in effect serve as a school for students in and outside of Yellowknife. That would make it possible for seniors in all 33 communities to remain in their own homes. This would make it possible thanks to the newly trained nurses and home care workers that would return to their communities to work in the field. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, looking forward into the future, I think the Department of Education, Culture and Employment should consider expanding the scope of current science curriculum being delivered at Arda College or Aurora College in Fort Smith. My vision for what the main changes might look like includes an implementation of fully fledged school for conservation and environmental studies. Mr. Speaker, such an investment in education would long serve the people of the N.W.T. on a number of fronts. Firstly, northern students who study this topic would acquire the option of remaining in the north during the entirety of their studies. Secondly, the N.W.T. would become better positioned to employ new students right out of post-secondary into a field of environment and conservation. Currently, Mr. Speaker, the federal government is investing in conservation across Canada. They put $1.3 billion in over the next 5 years as it has become the most significant investment in nature conservation in Canadian history. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Member statements like no diet sazasu den här karionde. Ami kanimule. Want to get anyone member N.W.T. sazino gion nadata.
Mr. Speaker, now we have an opportunity to engage the federal government and other non-government organizations to make a school such as this a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the N.W.T. Recreation and Parks Association's Active Elder Award was recognized to one of my constituents, Ms. Eunice Nasagalowak from Tuktoyaktuk, which recognizes an elder who is physically active. Mr. Speaker, Eunice has lived in Tuktoyaktuk for the past 52 years and enjoys being a part of the community. She gives back in so many ways through music, teaching, sharing her language, and volunteering at community events. Mr. Speaker, Eunice has been part of the Walk to Tuck Challenge for the past few years, keeping active and encouraging others to do the same. She is also an active singer, dancer, and drummer, and is always ready to share her skills with the youth. Mr. Speaker, she has raised money, written proposals, and organized trips for the dance group to Nome and Barrow, Alaska, Edmonton, Haines-Junction, Whitehorse. Mr. Speaker, Eunice enjoys playing the bass guitar for old-time dances and community gatherings, and volunteering at the End of the Road Music Festival in Tuktoyaktuk. She is also an excellent seamstress who always joins in for local sewing projects. Eunice takes advantage of every opportunity to share her language and culture with young people in the community. She brings traditional foods such as geese, caribou to the school so students from junior kindergarten to grade 9 can learn how to process meats. She shows the students how to clean, cut, and prepare the foods while also teaching them the different parts of Inuvialuktun. Mr. Speaker, Eunice has taught Inuvialuktun for many years in the community. She encourages graduates to continue their Inuvialuktun language. She is also a strong proponent of education, supporting youth, young people to go on to college or university, as they are the community's future leaders. At every event or opportunity, she's there to cheer on and encourage the youth. Mr. Speaker, today I would like you to join me in commending Eunice Nasagalowak, who's an inspiration to many elders, youth in her community and the territory around the country. Kuyanani, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I always advocate for my constituents, and when a constituent brings an issue to me, I always give them the benefit of the doubt, knowing there's at least two sides to a story. But I'll admit, when I've heard issues regarding my constituents' dealings with child and family services, I used to think that perhaps the emotional aspect of the situation made the interaction seem worse than it was. Well, Mr. Speaker, I apologize for that. I've been set straight by the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, which just released its audit of the Child and Family Services. It's a follow-up audit to the one performed in 2014, which exposed such poor performance that it demanded to be revisited. The Office of the Auditor General has concluded, Mr. Speaker, that things have actually gotten worse since 2014 and is, quote, deeply concerned by its findings. I tried to craft a statement with a level of outrage that this situation warrants, but I couldn't. There's no way to adequately express the anger that everyone should be feeling right now. We should all be ashamed, Mr. Speaker, for being part of a system that treats our most vulnerable in this way. If we can't put in the effort to get this right, then what? How bad is it, Mr. Speaker? Here's some of the findings. 1/5 of the time that someone contacted a regional health authority with concerns about the safety of a child, there was no response. 9 out of 10 times, the minimal level of contact with a parent and a child subject to a plan of care was not maintained. There was no systemic background checks on potential guardians, and the list goes on and on and on. After the last audit, the department's response was to introduce complex administrative changes into an already overburdened and over-bureaucratic system, instead of actually assessing whether or not it has the resources to do its job. Spoiler alert, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't. I also have to add, Mr. Speaker, that 95% of the children engaged in the system are Aboriginal. Is this what reconciliation looks like to this government, Mr. Speaker? I don't think that the minister is insensitive to this issue or the departmental staff doesn't care about the children. But after seeing what happened since 2014, I'm terrified about what the future holds. This is an unacceptable situation, and the minister and all of us in this House need to act or move aside for those who will. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on October 3rd, 2018, Rita Betsidia passed away. She was born on September 16th, 1992 at Old Fort Wrigley at 2 Baptiste and Alice Betsidia. She was one of 12 children. Growing up, she was Daddy's favorite girl. Her favorite times was when her dad came home from trapping with beaver meat full of fat. Family always remembered her little chin just dripping with fat. Her nickname was Little Doll. She brought a lot of joy to the home. She loved the outdoor and being with her family. At nighttime, she was asked her Abba to sit outside. When she was asked why, she would always reply, "I want to look at the stars." As a child, Rita attended residential school at La Pointe Hall in Fort Simpson. She didn't talk much about it, although throughout it all, Rita held her own language and traditional lifestyles. Her son Keith remembers all the hunting trips Rita came on. He recalls their time on the river as some of the happiest times in their lives, with lots of good food, stories, and laughter. Jonathan remembers the time one particular trip to Willow River when his Uncle Tony wanted to go for a skidoo ride. Haley, the youngest daughter, begged her mom to let her go, and off she went. Once they were past the falls, they stopped for a rest. Haley quietly told Jonathan, "Look, there are 2 mooses across the river." Tony shot one and Jonathan got the other. When they got back home, Haley ran into the house. "They got 2 moose," Jonathan said. And his mom came out and said she was very proud of him and couldn't stop smiling. Haley remembered her mom as always being the fun mom. She would play games and play jokes on them. One time when she was playing tags with the kids, they were all running around laughing until Rita stepped on the rake just the right way. Next thing she was screaming, "I raked myself, I raked myself." Miranda said her mom was always there for her. No matter what she asked, and her mom made it happen. She had a big heart and was always helping people. She loved her grandchildren with all her heart. She spoiled them all with her love and intention, but would protect them as furious as a mama bear. Rita is known and loved far and wide by many. She will be missed deeply by all her family and friends. Her quick wit and infectious laugh will sadly be missed. She was famous for saying, "Let's dance," and that is how people chose to remember her on this day. Mr. Speaker, I've been asked to wear this lapel by the family in recognition of her. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Our condolences to the family members as well in the community. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife South.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to recognize representatives of United Way N.W.T. that are here in the gallery. In attendance today, the Chair of the United Way N.W.T., Tracy St. Denis, United Way N.W.T. Board Member Matt Spence, also Gayla Thunstrom, the First Vice President of the Union of Northern Workers, Frank Walsh, and Jennifer Wright with the Union of Northern Workers, who are partners in United Way N.W.T. Also, I'd like to recognize 3 pages from Yellowknife South, who have been here for the 4 weeks of this session. Ayush Beno, Nigel Curtis, Tyson Clark, and also recognize all of the pages for all the good work that they've done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Grace Leaf.
Speaker, later today I'll be tabling the N.W.T. Disability Action Plan, so I'm very pleased to have the following people joining us today from the N.W.T. Disabilities Council. Terry Hawkins, the Chair, Cornelius Van Dyke, the Vice Chair, Tim Triggergo, the Board Member from Hay River, Christopher Aikens, Board Member from Hay River, Denise McKee, Executive Director, and thank you all for being here and being so supportive of the work we're doing to support persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also want to recognize a couple of members, board members of the N.W.T. Disabilities Council from Hay River, Mr. Christopher Aiken and Ms. Kim Triggerjo. Mr. Aiken is also the president of the Hay River Soup Kitchen that was the Premier mentioned earlier. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to, earlier on in my member statement, I mentioned Ms. Eunice Nasagalowak, who's an elder from Tuktoyaktuk. Mr. Speaker, Eunice is married to my relative, the late William Nasagalowak, and seeing her presentation yesterday was actually very uplifting. So I just want to thank Eunice for all the hard work that she does within the community and around the region with her culture and traditional knowledge. So keep up the good work, Eunice. Thank you. Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to recognize Matt Spence, Tracy St. Denis, Frank Walsh, and Susan Fitzke as constituents from Yellowknife North. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too want to recognize Matthew Spence and Tracy St. Denis on their contributions to the North in their private life and their career as well. Merci.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Trinity-Willowdale.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize a page from Trinity-Willowdale, April Sangre Hardesty Bolio, and also I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize our interpreters that are from Trinity-Willowdale, Moreau Sundberg and Tommy Onka. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we miss anyone in the gallery, thanks for being here with us. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Merci. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for Nahende.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the past few sittings, I've had the opportunity to ask the Minister of Health and Social Services a number of questions about having the residents of Fort Liard and Handy access to medical services via medical travel to Fort Nelson, BC. Can the Minister advise this House if the Department has been able to make some movement on this issue? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely. Staff from the Department of Health and Social Services did visit the community of Fort Liard as well as Fort Nelson to meet with residents of Fort Liard, but also staff of the health system in Fort Nelson to discuss, first off, what services are actually provided in Nelson. I think there's been some confusion over the years about what capacity Nelson has. They certainly aren't providing all the services that are offered here in the Northwest Territories or services that are required by residents of the Northwest Territories, but they certainly offer more than is being provided in Fort Liard. So we did reach out to them. We had some discussions about some things that we might be able to do for our residents in Fort Liard, things like mammograms and other diagnostic tests that Fort Nelson may be able to provide for us. We did meet with the MLA, myself and staff from the department with the MLA in September. We agreed to go to Fort Liard and Nahanni Butte to talk to the residents about what we've learned to help us formulate our next steps. We're hoping that we can put in some memorandums of agreement on some of those diagnostic tests, but also figure out how we might be able to provide some additional services, or rather have our residents receive services from Fort Nelson in a way that still fits within the N.W.T. Health and Social Services system. So we have made progress. We're not all the way there, but we are on the right path. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question like Kitade, Cassie member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's kind of answered a lot of my questions that I had here today, but that's great to hear. I'm very happy to see that. That's a positive step, and I have to applaud the department and the staff for reaching out to Fort Nelson, and we look forward to it. So the Minister talked about a couple of those mammograms and, I guess, mammograms and, forget the other one. The lab work, but also with pregnancy. Can the Minister explain or provide information if this opportunity is available as well?
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are services that aren't provided in Fort Nelson right now. I'm actually not 100% sure about pregnancy, but my suggestion would be that having individuals come to the boarding home here in Yellowknife or to services here in Yellowknife or Hay River might be more appropriate, as we might be, if there were any complications, we can deal with them within this existing system. If somebody's receiving services in Nelson and there's a complication, they could end up going into the BC system where we wouldn't necessarily have access to health records or history of the individual, which could provide some additional complications. Given that we do bring people in quite a bit earlier, I'm sure we can find ways to support those residents to come to northern locations where appropriate.
Oral question Tadade, Cassie member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for explaining and clarifying that, because that's very important for residents to understand that not all services are going to be available, but some are, and like he said, mammograms and lab services. So can the Minister advise us when they could see potential opportunities for this service to be implemented going to Fort Nelson? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, right now, residents from Liard and Nahanni can go to Fort Nelson if that's where they choose to receive services. We do have reciprocal billing agreements with all provinces and territories in this country. Our challenge, and I think the member understands this, is that when somebody uses their facilities without a referral in, they aren't necessarily covered for things like medical travel. There's also no ability to seamlessly share information where appropriate. What we're looking to do is actually fix that problem and find a way to refer people into Nelson so that they can take advantage of things like medical travel, and so that our doctors in the north can work seamlessly with those doctors in Fort Nelson to make sure that our residents receive seamless care. That work is underway right now. We are going to Liard and Nahanni in November. From there, we will figure out what our next steps are after we've talked to the community about where we are, what we've learned, and then we will be engaging with Fort Nelson again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Non direct cast member Nahende.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the minister making the commitment to come in November, and he's worked with his staff and that. So can the minister please advise this House when he goes into the community, what's going to happen? What is the department going to represent, and who's going to be coming in with him? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's the members' meeting. I'm going with the member. I anticipate he'll be helping set up those meetings. We are bringing the staff who have been working and negotiating with Nelson so that they can explain our findings, help the communities, both of them, understand what services Nelson provides and what services Nelson does not provide. Once again, I think there's some belief that Nelson can do everything and they are limited. There are certainly services they don't provide there. And then talk about next steps, how we can work together with the community to make sure that those services that can be provided in Nelson are properly set up so that our residents can have a more timely access to services. By way of example, we know that they are providing mammogram services in the community. It's a much shorter drive for residents to drive there to Nelson for services as opposed to getting on a plane, flying to Simpson, getting on another plane, flying to Yellowknife, spending a couple of days in Yellowknife, and then flying back. These individuals can get down there and back same day, if not one night, as opposed to many. So there's lots of opportunity here, and this is a good news story. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Canada member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. When he was a member of the Social Programs Standing Committee, he and his colleagues made 70 recommendations on the Child and Family Services Act. The committee report says, quote, "We also recognize that some of our most important recommendations will require investment. The committee believes very strongly that the future of the N.W.T. children and families warrants this investment." End quote. That was 9 years ago. What happened to those recommendations? Merci.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm actually quite proud of the work that we did in the 16th Assembly on that report. Tom Bolio, the member for Trinidad, was the chair of that committee. When I became the Minister of Health and Social Services 5 years ago, not 7, as the member has indicated, one of the first questions I asked is, where are we in implementing the recommendations from the Standing Committee? And I was deeply saddened to realize that no progress had been made on any of the recommendations. At that time, I made it a priority for the department to begin moving on those recommendations, moving forward on all those recommendations, which is where we came up with Building Stronger Families, which in retrospect is consistent with all the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation respecting children in care. It is a prevention-based system as opposed to an apprehension-based system. Over the last number of years, the last 3.5, 4 years, we have made significant changes to legislation as per the recommendations in both the Auditor General's report as well as the report from Standing Committee. We have stood up changes on the information systems. We heard clearly from our staff that our CFIS system was garbage and was not functional and not useful. We have brought in the matrix system. We made significant legislative changes to include the ability for youth beyond the age of 18 to receive services. And we have resources. We have put money into the systems that we put in place. I anticipate that members' questions are going to go to the fact that we haven't increased our staffing complement. And the members are 100% right. The audit was clear. In my opinion, we have done the right things with respect to the system we put in place, but we have failed to adequately resource. There's no question. To that end, I will be proposing an increase in positions in the next business planning cycle to address the most underserved areas. The member has identified some of them in her statement. In addition, we are going to continue to do more analysis on whether or not we got the right types of positions in there for a longer-term ask, which will be necessary in order to meet the needs of children and families in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, the findings of the audit were incredibly disappointing and of significant concern to me and to others. We are committed to making the improvements, utilizing Build a Stronger Families, working with our staff, and properly resourcing these services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the minister can't have it both ways. He can't say that he's doing everything possible to help Child and Family Services and then at the same time acknowledge that the Auditor General has again come up with another 11 recommendations that address children in jeopardy. These are not lightweight issues. They are the most, as my colleague from Hay River North said, the most vulnerable people in our society. So many of these recommendations have been repeated. Why are we waiting another 4 years for the minister to do what he already said he would do to the Auditor General in 2014? Thank you.
Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not arguing with the member. I've acknowledged that we need to do better, we need to do more. I do encourage the member to read the Auditor General's previous report. It was a far broader audit and actually included significant recommendations to actually improve accountability, improve the system. They didn't audit those portions of the system this time, and I can say that we have done those foundational pieces. That's where a lot of our attention was put. We did those while at the same time expecting our employees at the front line to evolve, but also continue providing services. Clearly, we spread them too thin. There's no question. Mr. Speaker, nowhere have I said we're planning to make these changes in 4 years. That's the member's statement. We're planning to, in the next 2 years, bring about profound changes in the delivery of Building Stronger Families that will meet the needs of our residents. There will always be risk. Our job is to mitigate and reduce risk as much as possible, and we're committed to doing that, and we've already started. Our internal audit, Mr. Speaker, has showed many of the same things that the Auditor General's report. We've been working on making these improvements over the last number of months. We can actually show some of those improvements now, and there will be things rolling out in the next couple of months, as well over the next 2 years, to bring about those changes that the member and all members and residents of the Northwest Territories want. We're committed to getting it right, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I think there's a misunderstanding here. The minister knew about these problems in 2009. He knew about them in 2014. He's been reminded about them this week. My question is, when is the minister going to show leadership on this issue? It's he who fights for the budget and argues for the spending priorities. And why over all these years has he been unable to make the business case to adequately finance Child and Family Services? Mercy.
Of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, the system that existed before was purely an apprehension-based system that did not actually focus on building families or supporting the residents of the Northwest Territories. If a child was at risk, they were taken. That is not what the residents of the Northwest Territories told us they wanted. They wanted a system that supported families and helped build families. That's what we have put in place. Again, we acknowledge that we did not necessarily get it right as far as rollout. We spread our staff too thin. We have invested millions of dollars in this change initiative to bring in the tools that our employees told us they must and need to have in order to do the work of Child and Family Services, which includes bringing in the system. So the member's assertion that nothing was invested in here is completely unfounded. Where we did not nail it, where we did not get it right, was providing our staff with the available resources. We're struggling in two ways, Mr. Speaker. We have massive turnover, which is incredibly frustrating. This is a very high burnout profession. And our employees are feeling the pressure of being spread too thin. We're working with them to address that. And I've already indicated we are intending to increase the number of positions through the next budget cycle. We have put in a proposal to do that, which is going to come to this House for all members to see. They can see the actions in front of them. They know what's coming, and we're prepared to invest more. We're prepared to get it right, Mr. Speaker.
Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have a firm grip on the timeline in which these changes are going to take place. What we've heard in 2014 We heard it in 2009, we heard it in the year 2000 from the Child Welfare League, is that these changes need to be made urgently. Children's lives are impacted by the decisions that are being made by the minister and his officials. So given the urgency that is repeated yet again, how is the minister going to ensure that this time the needs of children are going to be met? Massey.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, the members can have an opportunity, as will all members, to sit down with the department staff and go through the action plan that we're proposing. Many of the actions have already begun. When I saw the results, or rather when I saw the results of our own internal audit, one of my directions to the department was to begin anticipatory hiring and put in a more aggressive recruitment campaign to get out and get as many people into the pipe as possible, start getting these people in and trained up so that they can provide these services to the point where we're prepared to double fill some positions until such a time as new positions can be established. We know there's going to be turnover. We want to mitigate the harm caused by the revolving door of professionals. Having said that, these professionals are amazing. They're doing important work. They're doing it in a very difficult time of change. I've talked to many of the social workers, and I haven't felt opposition to building stronger families, but I have felt frustration and lack of resources. So I agree with the member. We're doing it. We're taking action. On December 12th, when the committee meets with the deputy and as well as the auditors, they're going to see the plan. And I'm looking for their input as well, Mr. Speaker. This is a territorial issue. This is an assembly issue. We're going to get it right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'd like to remind members that we've only gone through two members, and it's been 15 minutes. So I'd like to remind members to keep the preamble short and also answers from the executive as short as possible, because we still have 9 members to go through. So just a caution. Oral question, the member in N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to keep most of this short. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services on children in care. Mr. Speaker, children who are temporary and permanent care are extremely vulnerable in every aspect of their health and well-being, where their development is extremely dependent on the adults who control them and their environment. The Auditor General report has found that children were not consistently monitored and interviewed. Mr. Speaker, what can the minister do for these children if they are not being regularly contacted by Health and Social Services, and to ensure that the views of children in this system are known? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we did work very closely with the Auditor General during this report, and in a number of situations they did identify files and individuals where they thought there was some immediate risk. We dealt with those immediately. We reached out with our staff to engage with those people that were in immediate risk. In addition to that, we've also conducted some of our own audits. We've seen those things. We've been reaching out to residents across the Northwest Territories to make sure that we're actually meeting those standards now. And in many cases we are. We're still struggling in some jurisdictions where we have low staff numbers, which is one of the reasons we're working hard to fill some of these positions, recognizing we also hope to increase the number of positions through the next budgeting cycle should that pass in this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member in N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response. Mr. Speaker, earlier in this assembly I mentioned that that health is such a massive department. I think we need to look at something just for children and for elders, for that matter, so that we don't issues like this don't reoccur. Mr. Speaker, earlier I spoke about the extreme dependency children have on the adults they are surrounded with, and it is an injustice when children don't know their own rights. Mr. Speaker, what can the Health and Social Services do to ensure children and guardians are well aware of their child rights so that they are protected in mind, body, and spirit? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this is one of the areas where the auditor said we aren't doing as good as we need to do, and we aren't having as much follow-up with our residents. That includes both the families as well as the children as we need to. We are stepping that up. We are making sure moving forward that there is regular contact, and part of our requirement is to help people understand their rights under the legislation, but also the services that are available to them. We're trying to move away from the apprehension system more to a prevention system, so we're also working with families on a voluntary basis. We've had a significant increase increase in the number of voluntary files. We've seen a decrease in the number of permanent apprehensions. So in some areas, we're moving in the right direction. But when it comes to the individual contact with those kids, we need to do better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Cassie member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe it's an important aspect of everything. Sometimes we work around the system, but the system needs to focus more on human beings. Mr. Speaker, I know a woman in my riding who had to give up her child in order to help her escape the mother's impoverished circumstance. In foster care, foster parents are given a rate in order to meet the child's basic needs. Mr. Speaker, when guardianship is transferred to a relative, why aren't the relatives given the same foster rate to meet the child's basic need? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is one of the issues that came up in the review of Child and Family Services that the member from Tudinade and I participated in. We have made some changes within the system so that if a family member wants to foster the child and become their caregiver, we can actually facilitate that and help them and provide them with the foster fee. If they were to adopt the child, that would become a familial relationship and it wouldn't necessarily get some coverage. But once again, the system we're putting in place is about building stronger families and supporting families through these periods. So even if they were to take a child on and adopt them and then start experiencing some difficulties, they could still come to us on a voluntary basis and look for the supports they need on a short-term basis to help them get back to where they are, which is providing the care they need to their adopted children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Ikada County, the member Trinity Walladay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I talked about a couple of possibilities that I've been thinking about for post-secondary education, N.W.T. I recognize that one of the ideas I have on turning the Stanton Hospital into a school has lots of logistics to it, and it'll take a full department or several departments to work on it. But I'd like to ask the Minister of Education questions on what's possible in Fort Smith. In the foundational review, a lot of the programs and so on have been, it's contemplated to move a lot of the programs out of Fort Smith. I'd like to ask the Minister if she could start to look at the possibility of changing some of the programs from what currently exists to programs for the students will be studying the environment and conservation programs, I suppose. Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So first of all, I'd like to clarify, at no time is my intention to move programs out of Fort Smith. It's actually my vision is to actually expand and strengthen programs in all campuses. So it's not about one community or another. I do want to also talk about the idea of ENR and what the member talked about is that yes. So that's part of our visioning exercise that we need to do is going throughout the territories and looking at the strengths that we have to offer and getting that from all of the communities, all of the people, so that when people identify one of their strengths, ENR I see as one of our strengths. And then from that, then we work on the visioning exercise for the college to be able to actualize the territorial vision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Akira Cassie member Trinity Walladay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned the investment that the federal government will be making in conservation, and I agree with the minister that the ENRTP program is a good program, produces lots of good officers that are valuable to the communities. We also have other areas of land that need protection, with some of the work that we're doing in this House about improving some legislation for protected areas. I'd like to ask the minister if the minister could start working with the Indigenous governments to maybe look at the Indigenous guardianship programs, the Canadian Rangers, or even park officers for that matter, where Fort Smith sits at the edge of a huge one, well, probably the biggest national park in the country, and there's a lot of park officers there that could maybe get educated in Fort Smith. I'd like to ask the minister if she could look at the people involved in all of those areas, work with the people involved in all of those areas. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Education, culture, employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, it's definitely important. This is a territorial-wide issue. Our future for post-secondary is bigger than the people in this House. So it's important that we work with all of levels of government, our municipal governments and our Aboriginal governments, for two reasons: to find out how we can best support the students, and the second one is to look at our vision and look at what the strengths and identify areas that we can grow on. So yes, I am seeing that part of the vision exercise, that we would be consulting with Indigenous governments to see what their vision is as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member Untitled.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, staying in the area of education, but not something that I mentioned in my member statement, is a research center in Nuvik that's also part of the Aurora College. I'd like to ask the minister if she would look at what is possible for research. We are right at, it appears as though Nuvik is blessed with probably the best fiber links, the best internet connections in the world, and that there's a research center there. I'd like to ask the minister if her department could work with the research center to see how they could expand that to increase the studies and make a Nuvik Aurora College into a world-class research institution. Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do have to say I really appreciate the questions today, because the MLA has actually pointed out a lot of the vision things, a lot of our strengths, a lot of the areas that we need to work with. The reason that I'm really promoting to move into a Polytech university is because that research money is leaving the Northwest Territories. We have hundreds of universities coming across the world up to Nuvik to study our issues, and we're not tapping into that money because we're still a college. So moving into a Polytech university will allow us to not only access that money, but it keeps the knowledge in the Northwest Territories. It has a lot of potential, and I am certainly going to expand on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member Untitled.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And lastly, I guess is the more difficult of all of the tasks that I think we should be working on in post-secondary education is the nursing school in Yellowknife here for the old Stanton. I realize that the Department of Health has other usages for that, but I still feel that there's room for that place to become a good nursing school for home care that has so much potential for our communities and our elders, and a great way to keep the elders in their home as long as possible and save a lot of money in the system by not having them go into long-term care. So I'd like to ask the minister if she would continue work with the Department of Health and Social Services to see what's possible there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So currently our nursing students do actually utilize the Stanton Hospital for their practicums. That is very important. Hands-on learning is critical within any university or certificate or diploma degree programming. So we will continue to work with Health and Social Services on utilizing that. I do know, I hear the member and is saying that can we make the school there? That I cannot promise. What I can say is that the campus in Yellowknife has outgrown its current headquarters, and that has to be looked at. But at this point, I can't say whether it would be part of the old Stanton Hospital or if it would be a new building. But what I can promise is that we will continue to work with the Health and Social Services to make sure that we have the best practicum opportunities possible for our students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today my questions are directed to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. Mr. Speaker, the current Norman Wells Daycare Centre is fully furnished and the power remains hooked up. And I would like to also take the opportunity to thank the Minister for the previous letters of support submitted to the new Daycare Society. I'm very encouraged by this new society of young parents, long-term residents, and their new energy to get this centre up and running. My first question is, the Society has submitted to the Department an application for startup funds. When can they receive a reply to that application? Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really want to start with saying that I'm really excited about Norman Wells Daycare. One of our mandates is to get daycares in every community, as many as possible. There's lots of research. I could go on and on about the amount of research that says early intervention is the best intervention for children to ensure that they are successful in life. So Norman Wells is one that we've been watching closely. We're working closely with that community. I know that they have submitted their application. There's a little bit of processes. They need to get a fire and a health inspection. We are willing to work with them. And then once that inspections are done, we're hoping that they'll be started to provide services to children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Or a question that today, Cassie Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the question again. When can they receive a reply to the submitted application from the Society? Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So as a commitment, I know that there are processes, but if it makes the MLA feel better, then I can commit to, by the end of this week, we will phone Norman Wells, the Daycare Society, and actually help them to give them an answer and give them tell them what they need to go through. It is a process. They need to apply for the health and safety. They need to apply to the fire marshal to get those inspections. It's not as easy as just one department taking this over, but we are willing to work with them as much as possible to make this a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Or a question today, Cassie Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks for that answer. Now we've got a deadline for a yes or no. My next question is, because the Society has limitations, will the Minister's regional office assist the Society in working with the Department of Infrastructure to certify the building, as the Minister mentioned earlier, for the assistance? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've said it and I'll say it again that we are committed to making this a reality. We will do whatever we can to support the daycare, I'm not even sure what they're called, but the daycare center in Norman Wells. So if that means working with infrastructure, if that means helping them to fill out the applications, if that means walking into offices, we will do what we need to do to make this a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Or a question, today, Cassie Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very encouraged by the energy by the Minister's statement to assist the Society. You can imagine the Society, I know the individuals, they're young parents, they don't know the difference between a 2x4 and a building code, so I'm encouraged by the Minister's statement to help the young parents. Masi.
Masi, I take that as a comment. Or a question, Canada Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, further to my member's statement, there was a prominent case of cultural bias in the Northwest Territories with the death of Hugh Papik, an elder in Aklavik. A subsequent report made 16 recommendations to improve service delivery. Can the Minister of Health and Social Services give an update to this House on the progress the department's made in implementing those recommendations? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's completely inappropriate for any member in this House to be talking about an individual. I can say that there was a review done of a situation a number of years ago that resulted in some suggestions and recommendations on how to move forward to address systemic racism that exists here in the Northwest Territories. The member should be aware, because I was pretty sure he was in the House when we tabled in November 2016, building a culturally respectful health and social services system, which is our commitment to building a health and social services system that is culturally safe and respectful of all patients and clients across the Northwest Territories. A key component of that framework, of that document, was the requirement for an action plan, which we intend to release this fall, with a number of recommendations and programs to move forward with training our staff here in the Northwest Territories. We have cultural safety programs and training that have basically been developed. We're looking at piloting here before the end of the calendar year. We'll make revisions based on what we hear, and we will roll out on a territorial level for all health and social services staff starting in the 1920 fiscal year. So we have made significant progress in this area, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the Kidder, Cassie member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that case and other cases are well canvassed in the media, including the case of my constituent that I mentioned earlier. So I think they're subject to discussion in this House. Mr. Speaker, the cultural training and cultural safety and training piece is probably the largest part of these recommendations. Can the minister speak to some of the details of the cultural training program that is being developed by the department? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member's comment, but because other people breach those confidentiality and talk about things doesn't mean we in this Assembly should. I appreciate that the member is ultimately talking about cultural safety, and I appreciate that conversation, but it's inappropriate to use people's names in this House. We've done a significant amount of work to develop cultural safety training here in the Department of Health and Social Services. We have an Indigenous Health and Community Wellness Division who have actually worked with different Indigenous governments and individuals across the Northwest Territories to develop this meaningful training. We're about to pilot that. We're intending to pilot it between now and the end of the calendar year. From there, we anticipate that we'll have to make some tweaks here and there. Based on what we hear from the staff who are going through it, our intention is to finalize this fiscal year and begin rolling out for all staff over the next couple of years. It will be a training that's available for new staff as they come in as part of their orientation. Refreshers will be available as well. It's probably going to take us a bit of time to ensure that all health and social services staff have the training, because we also have to keep providing services while we're getting this training done. Mr. Speaker, this is well on its way. The action plan will be out in the next couple of weeks. Training is happening, and we're moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Kidder, Cassie member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the minister. I'd like to know what's the total budget allocation to this training? Do we have those details yet for the pilot program? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2017-18, the department allocated about $970,000, which came from the federal government under the Health Services Integration Fund. This included about $476,000 in carryover funding from the previous year to help us actually develop these programs, test these programs, reach out to other people throughout the Northwest Territories to make sure we're getting a proper cultural component to make sure that it's relevant to the people in the Northwest Territories, recognizing that it may be slightly different in Fort Smith than it might be in Polituck. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere, Cassie member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, finally, one of the issues is ensuring there's a process to respond to patient and family concerns related to issues that they hear from frontline medical service. Is a process to register those complaints and deal with them? Has that been established in the Health Authority? Thank you.
Minister of Social Service.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we have put in some quality assurance mechanisms within the Territorial Authority, Hay River, as well as the Tlicho, where if individuals have concern with the care they provided or any of their engagement with the authority, they should reach out to our quality assurance staff. They will be able to investigate the situation, find out what happened, and where appropriate, make recommendations so that we can fix those challenges in future so future people don't experience them, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Question, Canada member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to my earlier statement about the recent Auditor General report on Child and Family Services, I have some questions for the Minister of Health. The report notes that over the last 10 years, there's been about 1,000 children a year engaged in the system. And so we know there's not 10,000 children in the last 10 years who've been engaged. So does the Minister know how many individual children in the last 10 years have been engaged in the system? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, sorry.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on page 13 of the Director's report that I tabled late last week, there is a chart that shows the number of individuals who are in the system, or not in the system, but receiving services any given year. So, for instance, in the 17-18 year, there's 815 unique individuals who are receiving support. If you look at that chart, it will also show that there's multiple years. Many of those kids are in the system for many years. It's not like you're in 1 year and you're out the next. Sometimes it's the case, but not always. I don't have the total number of kids that received services over the 10 years. I'm not sure that it breaks down to that detail, but I will check to see if it's available. I will note, Mr. Speaker, that we have seen a decline in the number of kids in permanent care, also contained in the report. In 2008-2009, there's 244 kids in permanent care in the Northwest Territories. In 17 and 18, we're down to 152 children in permanent care. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the reason I ask that is because we know there's not 10,000 children. So are there maybe 2,000 or 3,000 children that have been in this system that's been failing them for that long? When you look at it that way, you realize that this has a major impact on these people's lives. The OAG staff was quoted in a recent article saying, despite multiple commitments to do so, the department has still not assessed whether the financial and human resource levels it allocates to authorities are enough to deliver the required services for children and families. And earlier, in response to the member for Yellowknife Centre's questions, the minister once again made a commitment to do just that. How do we know he's going to do that? How can he assure us that he's finally going to do what the department has said they were going to do for years? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that members think that nothing's happened, but a significant amount has happened. In fact, we did contract with the Child Welfare League of Canada to help us do the exact work that the members are asking us to do again. At that time, we were optimistic that they were going to provide us with a formula that would actually allow us to adequately resource the system, because clearly we feel that it is not. We did not get a report from the Child Welfare League of Canada that said, this is how many positions you need. What we got was, here's some things you need to consider when you're actually doing the evaluation to determine how many positions you need. We are taking their recommendations and their parameters, and we have started to apply those to help us determine what the appropriate number is, but also the appropriate makeup. One of the challenges they expressed is moving away from an apprehension system to a prevention system changes the makeup, and there really aren't any solid prevention systems out there. We're leading the way in many ways. Having said all that, we hear you. We have already begun the work to help us identify, and I will be and have proposed new positions starting next fiscal year, and I've already directed the department to start moving with anticipatory hiring to fill these positions. That's step one. We need to continue to do the work that members are describing to break in and look at the types of positions we need, recognizing that we have changed from an apprehension to a prevention type system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To clarify the minister's statements, I didn't think anything. That wasn't my thought. I quoted the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, who said that the department hadn't done what they said they were going to do. When the minister completes this work and determines how much resources are needed, will he commit to share that publicly so we can see exactly what needs to be done? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a CBC article today, the minister spoke about the difficulty in retaining social workers in the territory. It's a tough job. I mean, I don't think I could do it, and so I understand. Yet we have a social work program at Aurora College that's being cut, and I haven't heard anything coming from the Department of Health saying, no, wait, we need social workers here. So can the minister please explain what work has been done by his department to engage the ECE and engage Aurora College to try and build up this social work program so we can develop social workers here in the territory? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, we're running about a 25% vacancy in this area, vacancy rate in this area, so we lose about a quarter of our employees every year, which is deeply troubling, obviously. And I'm a firm believer that we want to recruit and retrain Northerners to do the important work that is needed in the Northwest Territories. I'm a very big supporter of, Northerners developing the skills to be social workers, which, if you don't have a previous history or previous background, would require a degree in social work. The social work program that exists now, unless you choose to go south for the second portion, only doesn't give you the degree. I have shared my needs with Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment, both of them. They know the demands we have. The demands for social workers is clearly articulated in Skills for Success. I don't think you'll find anybody in this building who doesn't want to support or feel the need for a degree-based social work program here in the Northwest Territories. What we need to do is make sure we get it right, and I think the foundational review that was done and the direction being put forward to move forward is the right direction and will lead us to having a high-quality social work degree program here in the Northwest Territories, so our residents can pursue that education. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Finance, who's in charge of carbon pricing. The Minister has said that we haven't quite signed on to carbon pricing by stating that a memorandum of understanding is yet to be completed. Can the Minister explain what this memorandum of understanding is all about and whether there's a deadline for its completion? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The federal government had proposed that there be an MOU signed with the 3 territories. It turned out the MOU was largely applicable to our sister territories because they were using where they were using the federal backstop. The federal government had indicated just recently that they are not advancing the MOU with us as what would be included has already occurred. With the release earlier this week, the federal government has confirmed their agreement with the proposed N.W.T approach to carbon pricing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. I'd be interested in seeing the written confirmation about how the feds have agreed to our approach. But the Minister released a plan for carbon tax in July. That approach would see large emitters getting all of the taxes back. It may involve some spending on greenhouse gas reduction measures, but while individuals, families, and small businesses will get some of the carbon tax back, the remaining amount is what will be used to subsidize N.W.T investments into the energy strategy, including Taltson hydro expansion. Can the Minister explain why large industrial emitters will not be contributing to investments in energy for communities and households? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Speaker. The proposed approach for us is to rebate for fuel used for heating and electricity generation for the large emitters. 75% will be rebated back to them. The other 25% will be put into a trust that they can use to make investments into reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for confirming that the large emitters are not going to be contributing towards energy investments for communities and households. Regular MLAs and the public have been waiting patiently for the costed action plan for the climate change strategic framework, and that's a key part of our climate change plan that includes carbon pricing. So we've had an action plan for the energy strategy since May. Can the Minister tell us when the regular MLAs and the public will get a costed action plan for the climate change strategic framework and why this is so out of sync with the work that's already been done on the energy strategy? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I did not confirm that the large emitters, what I confirmed was that 75% would be rebated back to them and the other 25% would be going to their investments into greenhouse gas emission. You could look at it another way where with all the carbon or with all the corporate tax that they're paying, they're funding a lot of the programs that we offer across the Northwest Territories. So they do make a contribution to that as well. But to the member's question, the draft action plan was, we shared that with committee, Indigenous governments and organizations for a 4-week review commencing the end of October. Once the feedback is received from the parties during the plan engagement period, ENR will lead the finalization of the action plan. So it should be, we want to go out there and have a conversation with committee and members of the public on the action plan, and then we will do the finalization of that action plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Nundere Kasi, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. I look forward to seeing this draft action plan. So the carbon tax plan released by the Minister in July does not contain any information or analysis of other scenarios or approaches, including the federal backstop. Federal government just announced how funds will be redistributed in jurisdictions that do not have a federally approved scheme. It's not clear to me whether our government's actually done any analysis on the federal backstop. Can the Minister explain whether the work on an N.W.T. carbon tax considered other scenarios, including the federal backstop, and can he share this information with the public and regular MLAs? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, when we released our planned approach in July of 2018, we also released the results of the engagement process. A lot of the background material is available on the Department of N.W.T. or Department of Finance website, and we did share what the analysis of the federal backstop would be, and we know that it was going to cost residents of the Northwest Territories a lot more had we just gone and used their backstop. And it's noteworthy that the federal approach to offset in other provinces where the federal backstop is being used is quite similar to what we announced in July. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, follow up to my member's statement, I have a few questions for the Minister responsible for the N.W.T. Housing Corporation. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister, what is the exact dollar amount and what is the impact of these changes on the average tenant's power bill? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, in the member's opening comments, or in his member statement, he is right that over the past 3 years, public housing tenant power rates have been gradually increasing to adjust in line with what other households in the N.W.T. communities are paying under the GNWT's territorial power support program. The impact from the last base rate adjustment would be approximately $36 per month for the average household, and then it was about $87 per month, considering all base rate adjustments over the last 3 years. Mr. Speaker, we do face a challenge here in the Northwest Territories with the N.W.T. Housing Corporation and the increased costs to run our programs, but utilities are a big cost of that. We're trying to find ways we can address that, and I really appreciate the member's comments that these are all good goals moving forward in his member statement. I think we're on the right track, and we want to work with communities, leaders, so that they can be more self-reliant, be more energy conservative with how we do programs in the communities, but also ensure that we're able to sustain a lot of our housing programs and not just continuing to pay our tenants' power rates. We also have other programs that we do need to sustain throughout the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Housing Corporation also intends to conserve corporation funds through this initiative. Has the corporation calculated to what extent costs have simply been passed to income security programs in the Department of Education, Culture and Employment? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We always try to work closely with our partners, especially within the department. We keep them apprised of how many housing tenants we have, let them know of the programs that we are doing, and especially with the tenants, when these programs came into place, we directly contacted the tenants to let them know what was going on. Our local housing organizations also give information on what we're doing moving forward, but we do keep a good communication with our all of our departments right across the government with our programs and how it can possibly impact their programs that they run as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Cassie, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister answered my next question, but I have one more here. In addition to adjusting power subsidies, what other actions is the corporation taking to encourage energy conservation and reduce energy consumption in public housing? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since we've put some of this this particular program in since 2015-16, I think it's really a positive note to say that power consumption has declined by about 8% in the communities. That means our tenants are becoming more aware of their usage, as well as, like I said earlier, trying to be more conservative on their energy and also a little bit more self-reliant, but also understand that we got other programs that we got to sustain in the and within the N.W.T. Housing Corp. I do have a list of some of the programs that we have done in this area. We invest in energy efficient building practices, and that's well known with the work that we've done with IRC as well as other Indigenous governments over the last couple years. Alternative energy products such as solar panels in some of the communities, solar hot water, district heating, LED lighting, home ownership programs that do promote energy efficiencies. And as we look at constructing new homes, we always look at making them as energy efficient as possible. So we've taken a turn, and we're going to continue to do that with future bills, and also promote that with our partners as they're looking at building infrastructure in their communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Ikeda County, the member Nehende.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the last couple of days, I've been asking the Minister of Land some questions about the process here. So, in this House, he talked about IGOs. Can identify which cabins are right-based cabins. Can the Minister please advise what he and the department mean by right-based cabins? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we know, there are many structures on the public lands that are administered by this government, and that's why we're engaging with Indigenous governments at this time to determine how we can find out how many there are and on what basis the claims that they are right-based are made. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakeda Cassie, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I've heard that a number of times. I've asked the Minister, what do they mean by rights-based cabins? That's all I'm trying to ask. What's their definition, or how are they getting this information out there? I'd like to know what that means. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, there are a great number of cabins and camps out there, rights-based ones, that would be ones that are associated with an Aboriginal right to have the cabin or camp. So that's what we're looking into at this time. We really don't know how many there are out there. That's why we're engaging with Aboriginal groups throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Really didn't ask my question. It says, how many cabins out there, and they're looking at it and that. Again, does the department have a definition that they can use that says rights-based cabins, and the department, how they check it off, say, yeah, it's used for hunting, it's used for trapping, is it used for this? Do they have a definition of how they make that decision? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are dealing with this exact issue in our consultations with Indigenous groups throughout the Northwest Territories. Some of the conditions that we might see as important are Indigenous ownership located within an area where persons of that heritage have established or asserted rights, an assertion by the member, or the owner of the cabin or camp of his Aboriginal rights. So those are some of the basic things we're going to be looking at as we engage with Aboriginal groups throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question. Non-dire council member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I greatly appreciate the minister's answer and helping us understand it a little bit better. So my last question here is, once these cabins are classified as rights-based cabins, and I believe this is stage 1 or whatever stage it is in, is this the end of the process for Indigenous cabin owners that are fearing that they're going to see their cabins be targeted for potential lease fees in the future? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those are issues that certainly will have to be determined. Once we find out how many of the cabins are actually rights-based, we will be dealing with those additional issues also. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports on Committee on Review of Bills. Reports of Committee on Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 3 documents entitled Government of the Northwest Territories Disability Action Plan 2018-19 to 21-22, Northern Pacific Affairs Volume 6, Special Issue Number 1, 2018, the Pan-Territorial on the Land Summit, and the Northwest Territories Oral Health Action Plan 2018-19 to 2020-2021. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Monday, October 29, 2018, I will move that Bill 29, an act to amend the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion, first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Thabacha, that Bill 24, an act to amend the Elections and Plebiscites Act, be read for the first time. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Motions in order. Motions non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 24 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Yellowknife South, that Bill 27, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Infrastructure Expenditures Number 3, 2018-19, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motions in order. Motions non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 27 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, second by the honourable member for Thabacha, that Bill 28, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Operations Expenditures Number 3, 2018-2019, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motion is in order. Motion is non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 28 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, second by the honourable member for Yellowknife South, that Bill 27, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Infrastructure Expenditures Number 3, 2018-2019, be read for the second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill makes supplementary appropriations for infrastructure expenditures for the Government of the Northwest Territories for the 2018-2019 fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motion is in order to the principle of the bill. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 27 has had a second reading. Second reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move, seconded by the honourable member for Thabacha, that Bill 28, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures Number 3, 2018-2019, be read for the second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill makes supplementary appropriations for operation expenditures for the Government of the Northwest Territories for the 2018-2019 fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motions in order to the principle of the bill. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 28 has had a second reading. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 19-183. Minister Statement 103-183. Table document 215-183 with member Hay River North in the chair.
I will now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee would like to take into consideration table document 215-18 brackets 3 capital estimates 2019-2020 and to consider opening remarks for the capital estimates and the Departments of Environment and Natural Resources, the Department of Lands, and the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Does the committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will consider the document after a brief recess. I will now call Committee of the Whole back to order. Committee, we have agreed to consider table document 215-18(3), capital estimates 2019-2020. We're going to do things a little differently than we've done in the past, and just so everyone knows what's going on, we will have opening comments from the Minister of Finance, and then we will have general comments from committee, at which time the Minister of Finance will take the witness table with some witnesses. And as we move into the departments, the ministers will switch out if necessary, and new witnesses will come in. Traditionally, we've just had the Minister of Finance at the witness table for the entire capital estimates. So I just want to get everyone up to speed. So first, I will turn to the Minister of Finance for opening remarks. Minister MacLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm here to present the Government of Northwest Territories Capital Estimates 2019-2020. The Capital Estimates 2019-2020 totals $325 million, of which $94 million is being funded by the federal government. The capital estimates include $199 million for tangible capital assets, $74 million for infrastructure contributions, $50 million for public-private partnerships, and $2 million for deferred maintenance. Consistent with prior years, the capital estimates 2019-20 do not include appropriations for housing infrastructure proposed by the N.W.T. Housing Corporation in 2019-2020. The appropriation for these investments will be sought during the Legislative Assembly's review of the 2019-2020 main estimates. The N.W.T. Housing Corporation 2019-2020 capital plan totaling $18 million is included in the capital estimates as an information item for review and comment. Major highlights of the capital estimates include $118 million for highways, winter roads, bridges, and culverts across the N.W.T. This includes funding of $49 million for the Clecho All-Season Road Project, $22 million under the National Trade Corridors Fund, and $34 million for Building Canada Plan projects. $42 million towards energy projects under the Investment in Canada Plan, which includes $18 million for the Inuvik Wind Project. $62 million for health facility replacements, renovations, and equipment, which includes funding of $25 million for long-term care facilities in Hay River and Inuvik. $29 million to continue funding to community government for their infrastructure needs. $17 million for new education facilities and renovations to existing facilities, which includes $12 million for the major retrofit of the Mangalanik School in Tuktoyaktuk and $3 million for the replacement of J.H. Sissons in Yellowknife. $9 million for deferred maintenance and energy upgrades to existing GNWT assets, and $8 million for new and enhanced information technology functionality and upgrade. That concludes my opening remarks, Mr. Chair. I would be pleased to answer any questions members may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Would the Sergeant at Arms please escort the Minister's witnesses into the chamber? Minister, you may take your seat at the witness table. Minister, would you please introduce your witness to the House?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have with me Mr. Sandy Kugliptar, who is the Deputy Secretary to the FMB. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. I will open the floor to general comments from committee to the capital estimates as a whole. If there are detailed questions, please hold them until we get to the detail contained within the document. Any general comments from committee on the capital estimates? Ms. Green.
Or Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I note that this is the biggest ever, apparently, infrastructure budget, the bulk of which is going towards roads, and the bulk of which is being driven by the federal government's shared cost projects that are going on. at the moment. I recognize that these projects are an important generator of labour income in communities throughout the N.W.T, but it's not clear at all how much of that labour is N.W.T labour, especially given the scope and size of these projects. And I wonder as well, given that, whether it would make more sense to spread the money out. So it seems as if this is a similar situation that we got into with the mines, where they were all developed at once and enough to supply labour to all three. And I wonder if the same thing will happen with these large infrastructure projects. We do know that there have been considerable carryovers year to year because of the amount of spending to be done and the relative lack of contractors. What I see as well in this budget is that much needed investment in new schools is being pushed off into the 19th Assembly. There are key school projects that need to be completed where schools are inadequate for the size of the student population, or they are inadequate because they have become in need of a major retrofit. So what I see is that investment has mostly been put. I also note that there are no new investments in building new housing, although we know that more housing is needed, especially for seniors. There are huge waiting lists for rent-geared income housing, affordable housing here in Yellowknife. And we know that Mary Murphy Seniors Home is aging and will need to be replaced. We also know that the Rock Hill Apartments have burned down, and there is hope for a replacement of that building. And also, of course, a replacement for the Hay River Family Support Centre. And it's important to note that that's not the only family support centre that is in dire need of replacement. Of course, that particular building has been torn down, but it's my understanding that the family violence shelter in Tuktoyaktuk is not in very good shape either. So there are, of course, more projects in the queue, and roads seem to be taking a disproportionate amount of space here. The other thing I wanted to mention of projects in the queue is an investment in tourism is required above and beyond what is mentioned in this capital estimate, specifically in a visitor information centre for Yellowknife, another in Tuktoyaktuk, and for park expansions in both places where the parks become in Yellowknife area become very full, and in Tuktoyaktuk where there are very limited tourism facilities, and more are needed now that that road is open. I realize this is a capital budget, but I really do think that we need more money for the operating budgets, and we don't have to look any further than today's debate about resourcing the Child and Family Services area of Health and Social Services. Clearly it is under-resourced. It has been under-resourced for many years, and there is more money required in that operating budget. And there are other budgets that we've discussed, operations and maintenance, departmental budgets, where we've identified a need for more spending to keep up with the demand for services, let alone introduce new ones. So with that said, I'm looking forward to debating the details of the capital budget when we get into the particular departments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Next, I have Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm pleased to see that we have the capital budget before us. I do appreciate that this is a significant capital investment for us, a little bit more than what we normally see on a year-to-year basis in capital. I appreciate that the federal government this year is aligning themselves to make significant dollar matching contributions. A good portion of this year's capital budget is going to be, we're going to be able to expand on it significantly because a number of our dollars are going to be matched by federal dollars to the tune of 75 cents for every 25 cents of ours. And so that's a welcomed partnership and relationship with the federal government that's going to lead to critical pieces of infrastructure that will continue to build strong and, of course, sustainable territory and necessary infrastructure that we need in many aspects, whether it's, and this is something I wanted to allude to, was that, while their investments in highways and roads are significant, and that's just the nature of those types of projects, that we are also making significant headway in a number of other areas. And I think it's worth noting that $42 million towards energy projects is a very significant investment. We continue to make very good investments in upgrading and replacement of health facilities. We've been doing that for a number of years. But we're also continuing on our deferred maintenance program, and that also includes a number of energy upgrades to N.W.T owned assets to the tune of about another $9 million. So given the size of our jurisdiction and our population, and I'm rather impressed with the investment that we're making in capital dollars towards energy upgrades and energy initiatives for our size of territory. That said, though, I do have an underlying concern. Capital dollars are dollars that are often spent outside of the city of Yellowknife and are expended in a number of the remote and smaller communities, and allow for significant increase in employment opportunities in those regions. And as we've heard before, or just heard earlier from my honourable colleague from Yellowknife Centre, is that carryovers remains a concern. And I'm hoping that the Department of Finance can find some solutions to the challenges, of which I know there's no easy solution, and that there are a number of facets involved as to why projects can be difficult to deliver upon, but that there needs to be some considerable effort put towards reducing our annual carryovers. In our last couple of capital budgets, we've seen instances where almost 50% of that year's budget has been carried forward. And now with a capital budget that is one of the largest that we've seen in a number of years, this remains a concern. So I'm hoping that we can hear from the department on some of the aspects that they are hoping to undertake in order to overcome that challenge. That's it for now. I don't really have any specifics until we get into department by department. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Next on my list, I have Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to see a large infrastructure investment being brought before the House. I think infrastructure is the easiest way to create growth and jobs in the short term, and if the projects are targeted in a good way, they can be a strategic investment in the future of all our communities and the future of our economy. I think my only real concerns is actually the large size of this budget, and my colleague, the honourable member from Yellowknife North, spoke well to this point. If you look at the percentage of infrastructure carryovers from 2002 to 2013, the average was 32% of all funds carried over into the next year. If we apply that percentage to this proposed budget, that's $103 million. From 17-18 to 18-19, the carryover percentage was 46%, 130 million of 270 million in the total appropriation. So my concerns are primarily around that. I would love to see all of this appropriation get spent and directly invested, but it does seem like the government struggles at times to move all of the infrastructure investment out the door. I'm hoping that I know the minister's given this some thought and has some ideas on how we can improve this. But if we're looking at nearly 50% of this appropriation not being spent in the year it's supposed to be, I think we have to really ask ourselves, are we doing the best job we can in investing in the economy and investing in critical infrastructure? It's a big territory, and I know many of my colleagues have issues with the large percentage of capital spending on highways, roads, bridges, and culverts. But given the size and the geographical remoteness, I think those investments are just a necessity of life in the N.W.T. So I think we have to do the best job we can in this last term to make the biggest impact on the economy, and I think this budget is headed in the right direction. But I would appreciate if the minister could alleviate some of my concerns around these large percentages of carryovers that we see year and year again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Do you have further comments? Mr. Testart?
No, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Then what we'll do is we'll do a round of general comments, and I'll give the minister a chance to respond. Next, I have Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I do have some general questions for the minister, so I'd like to start with whether there's been any calculations done to ensure that the capital budget fully complies with the fiscal responsibility policy. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
It does. Yes, it does. Sorry, I was caught off guard there. You said we're going to do a round and then have the minister respond to all concerns at once. But yes.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly threw a wrench in our plan here, and he has specific questions. So he's got nine minutes of specific questions for you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure I've got 9 minutes of questions, but I like the idea of wrenches. So if the minister has done those calculations, is that something that can be shared with the public? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
I don't see why not, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I look forward to the minister then finding a way to make that information public, whether he tables it in-house or posts it on the Department of Finance website. Those would be two suggestions. I've heard some concerns from regular MLAs, and I too have concerns about the amount of carryovers. Can the minister tell us, is there a percentage of the capital budget that really represents carryovers or a dollar amount that would allow us to understand what the carryovers are from previous years? Can the minister provide that information? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
I forgot what you said already. Oh, we do allow for carryovers.
We do our fiscal.
Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, in all fairness to some of the previous speakers that had some concerns with carryovers, I think I may as well address that issue right now. The members are correct. There is a significant amount of carryovers. Last year, I believe it was about about a little over $100 million in carryovers. Could be for different reasons. Projects could be in the planning stages. The money is appropriated for particular projects. Could be in the planning stages. Contracts could not be let. Contracts could be just being signed. So that could be some of the reasons for the carryovers. I have had discussions with my cabinet FMB colleagues, and I have asked them about the amount of carryovers, and that there was a concern with the amount of carryovers, and if projects were sitting in the hopper for too long, then maybe it's time that we we reallocated that money, and if there hasn't been any significant movement on some of the projects, and so I will be monitoring that quite closely to be sure that we don't have too many projects sitting in the hopper for a couple, 3 years, 2 or 3 years, and if there's an opportunity to use that money elsewhere. And as to the member's second point there, so I hope that addresses some of the members' concerns with the amount of carryovers we have. There's different reasons for carryovers, and maybe this is an item that I need to sit down with committee and give them a good briefing on it, and with some of the numbers that are involved. But as for the member's other question, I'm going to ask Mr. Kugluktar to reply to it, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Kilgoodkar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in terms of the funding that's being requested for the 1920 budget, there's no provisions for carryovers in the 1920 capital estimates. These are the funding that we are anticipating to spend in 1920. The carryover amounts usually come forward via the SUP process. So, and you'll likely see the carryovers for the 18-19 fiscal year in the first SUP in the 1920 fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, if I wasn't confused before, in any event, the minister indicated that probably in the neighborhood of $100 million on a capital budget of maybe $230 million of our own money. That's like about, and I don't have a calculator, that's 40% is carryovers from previous years. That's a very significant amount of money that's being carried over. I appreciate that the minister has said that he's going to monitor this more carefully. I hope that he can find a way to report that as well to us as regular MLAs. But in the tracking that's done, it's going to be very important to understand the cause of the delays. Is the cause of the delays within the departments that are supposed to be spending the money, or is the cause of the delays within a department like infrastructure that takes care of procurement because they may not have enough resources to get the contracts or tenders out the door? So then the department that was going to spend the money gets penalized? That's what I'm concerned about. So can the minister tell us what kind of tracking system he's going to put in place, and whether it's going to, how he's going to prevent departments that want to get projects done from being penalized if there's capacity issues within a department like infrastructure that takes care of procurement? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Can the minister clarify whether the carryover amount is included in this capital budget? I believe you said it was going to be included in the SUP, so this $324 million is all new money. It doesn't include any carryovers. Can you first confirm that? Thank you.
You're absolutely correct, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now can you answer Mr. O'Reilly's question?
Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly asked what the issues were in getting the money out. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I did state before, one of the first things that I had to try and monitor this is to put the departments on notice, my colleagues on notice, that I will be monitoring this, and I'm sure as we gather the information, we'll have a fairly good indication of why some of the projects are late. Maybe the specs haven't been done. I mean, it could be a number of different reasons. I can't sit here and start to speculate on what some of those reasons are, but I have made a commitment that we would monitor this a lot closer to make sure that the money that's being allocated goes out the door. And if there's a bottleneck somewhere, or if there's an issue with the department itself, or whoever is administering the contracts on their behalf, then I think we'll have an opportunity through the monitoring to identify that and take steps to address it. If it's resources, capacity, then we'll have to deal with it at that particular time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Now that the clock's almost run out, I do have some bigger picture concerns along, with the capital budget that I think have been articulated by some of my colleagues as well. There's an overwhelming focus on roads again, and I understand that some of this is related to federal funding, but I noticed, and I've been said in the House, that our sister territory, Nunavut, has found ways to support public housing to a greater extent than we have through federal infrastructure funding. I'm concerned about the local government funding gap, municipal funding gap that we've had identified over a number of years, and how much progress we're going to be making on that, and I'll raise that at the appropriate time. I've heard about the lack of tourism investment in Yellowknife and in N.W.T. Yeah, I think that's all I can squeeze in, Mr. Chair, for now, but I appreciate the commitment that the Minister has made on tracking and reporting on carryovers, and I hope that he can find a way to share that on a regular basis with us on this side of the House. In future capital estimates, if he can find a way to document compliance with the fiscal responsibility policy as well, that would be helpful. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Next, I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do support this capital budget and think about the remote area connections with the capital investments, keeping in mind the receiver of the capital budget allowances for these various initiatives would be the creation of income for various families that are looking forward to some of these projects coming on stream, and also being mindful that this government has exhausted and created a partnership with the federal counterparts. So it's good to see that. And I'm also mindful of it's hard to be a solution provider to anything and everything when you consider the large area we have and the logistical challenges of supporting projects. So certainly there's going to be a carryover. Most areas are seasonally accessible, so given that principle, it creates carryover. So in short, I like the energy that went into this large capital initiative, and look forward to going through the detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be as short as possible because the Minister's heard a number of our colleagues talk here. So my big concern is the municipal funding shortfall. If we're talking 20 million plus, and that there seems to be a huge issue that we still haven't dealt with. If we're having this carryover after year, maybe that's something that we need to be looking at, is putting funding into the municipal governments to help them deal with their capital needs and issues as we move forward. So that there should be addressed. I do have some concerns with housing and some of the challenges there. But again, I know it's just information here, but I just like to make sure the minister is aware of that. And at that point, I guess my other big issue is the infrastructure, and we talk about roads, but again, it's isolated small communities in the riding I represent that need some work done. And when I'm talking about work, we're not talking about chip sealing. We're talking about being able to utilize the roads, and that's what I'm trying to. I hear from the communities. I hear from the three in particular: Jean Marie, Wrigley, or Jean Marie, Sumbakay, and Hanny View. And so that they're just trying to access, whether it's seasonal or all year round, and they need some work done to those roads. So I'm hoping that the government can look at that and move forward. I do have to give the government credit that they've, this is the biggest capital investment that seems to have hit the assemblies here. So I do have to thank the government for looking at that. But again, there are some shortfalls in some areas, and I'll have questions for the particular departments as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. There's no one further on the list, so I will give the Minister up to 10 minutes to respond to the general comments. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the committee for some of their comments. And we hear their concerns. Members are absolutely correct. This is probably the biggest budget, the capital budget this territory has ever seen. And with some of the carryovers, I think that increases it even more. But this is much needed investment in a territory that's things are very slow now. And we see the importance of a lot of the capital investment across the Northwest Territories. There were some concerns with the money that was going into roads, but you have to be without a road to understand the importance of having a road. And I think we have to look no further than the ITH and the benefit it's brought to the people up there. And if you can leverage 75 cents on the dollar and use 25 cents of your own dollar to move your projects ahead, I think that is wise use of money. That allows us as a government to reinvest some of the money that we may have invested into these particular initiatives somewhere else. I think I was just asking Mr. Kugluktar what our normal capital budget was, and I think it's in around $200 million, maybe just under $200 million. But with the significant amount of investment we've had from the federal government, we've been able to increase that to $325 or $340 million. So it's a welcome investment, and we hear the concerns of the members. The carryovers, I spoke a bit to the carryovers before. Building new housing, I'm sure the Minister of Housing has heard your concerns, and you'll have more discussion when you get into the housing information item. There is some challenge with housing. On the, I think it was member from Nahande raised the investment in community money. The $29 million we're investing into this particular capital budget is an increase from the $27 million in capital infrastructure money that's been part of the community budget for, I think, almost since the New Deal in 2007. That number has finally gone up this year, so it's $29 million. The funding shortfall that members speak of is more on the operations side, but there's an opportunity for the communities, from my understanding, is that they're able to use 5 or up to 10% of the infrastructure money to help deal with some of the operation challenges, because communities are much appreciative of the investment in infrastructure. One of the things in my time as Minister of MACA that I heard from the N.W.T. Association of Communities is they have all this capital money, they're putting it toward a lot of their capital projects, but on the operations side is where they were concerned with so many capital projects coming on stream. They didn't feel they had sufficient operation. There was a lot of work done a few years ago to try and address that, and I think in the last couple of operations budget we've made investments into trying to address the funding gap. It's still a large gap. There was a lot of good work that was done, I think, in the end of the 16th Legislative Assembly. On the Child and Family Services, you heard the Minister say before in responding to questions that they were looking at bringing forward they're doing some work right now. They're looking forward to bringing a proposal to the FMB to see if there's more money that could be had for some of the programs that they offer. Energy projects, appreciate the comments from the member from Yellowknife North on the there's a lot of money being invested into energy projects, and that's the way to the future. One of the things in my time here in the Assembly and having traveled all across the Northwest Territories, visited every community, my time as Minister of Housing, I had an opportunity to visit a lot of the local housing authorities, and I was always quite impressed with the proactive steps they were taking and already starting to invest into a lot of energy projects, because we were dealing with climate change and the high cost of living before it was big news. We were dealing with it, and now that it's out there, we've been able to leverage a lot of investment into many of the projects that we want to see go forward. But I know our folks have been doing a lot of work out in the front lines trying to address it and dealing with climate change and houses getting awfully close to the bank, and so the federal investment is quite welcome. I think it was a member from Yellowknife Centre who talked about such a large infrastructure budget and the fact that we may not have the capacity or the labor force to do it. In some of the work that we've done, we're thinking that this has the potential to create up to 1,200 jobs, I think is a figure I've seen somewhere. And of course there is going to be concern with such large infrastructure projects. Some may be awarded to firms from the south, we don't know that, and some may have to bring in some people from the south, and hopefully, like a lot of people, they fall in love with the north and just decide to stay here. But if you notice, a lot of this money a lot of it's in the regions and in some of the smaller communities where we would like them to take advantage of the local labor force that they have in the communities, which would be a benefit. Again, I use the Inuvik Highway for an example because that created close to 600 jobs. 85% of those jobs were people from the Bodell and parts of other parts of the Northwest Territories, and I seen the fact that income support payments had gone down and housing rent collections had gone up, and that I think was just a benefit of having that project go ahead. And now you see, I talk to folks from Tuktoyaktuk a lot up in Inuvik. They drive in and they're very pleased with the road and the benefits that it's brought to them. So as I said before, you have to go without a road to appreciate the value that a road brings to your area. And if we can use federal money to help leverage 75 cents, if I can use 75 cents of your money and put in 25 cents of my own to buy something, why not? It's just good business, and it's beneficial. So there was another number of other areas that were touched on. I hope I responded to most of the major issues that were raised, or all the issues that were raised. Again, we do have a very significant capital budget, but I believe at this time it's a much needed investment with the economy slowing down in some parts of the Northwest Territories, and where the government, the work that's coming for the government through the capital budget would be fairly welcome. So, excuse me, Mr. Chair, so I think I've addressed a lot of the concerns, and as we go into each department's capital budget, I'm sure members will have more detailed questions that the minister of that particular department will be in a better position to answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. The committee, we have agreed to first consider the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, so I will thank the witness for joining us. And Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witness from the chamber. And Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses back into the chamber. Committee, we have before us Minister MacLeod, but this time in his role as the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources. Minister, would you please introduce your witnesses to the House?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, to my right, I have Dr. Joe Dragon, Deputy Minister of Environment and Natural Resources. To my left, I have the well-dressed Dennis Malachori, Director of Corporate Services.
Good one.
Thank you, Minister. Committee, Department of Environment and Natural Resources begins on page 16 of the capital estimates. As always, we will defer departmental total until after consideration of the activity summaries, the first of which can be found on page 18, Environmental Protection and Waste Management. If committee has comments or questions about this item or the associated information item on the next page, now is the time to get those out. Seeing none, I will call this item. Environment and Natural Resources, Environmental Protection and Waste Management, Infrastructure Investments, $140,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 20, Forest Management. There's an associated information item on page 21. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I will call this item. Environment and Natural Resources, Forest Management, Infrastructure Investments, $1,149,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 22. Water Management and Monitoring. There's an information item on page 23. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I will call the item. Environment and Natural Resources, Water Management and Monitoring, Infrastructure Investments, $125,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Wildlife on page 24. With an information item on page 25. Seeing nothing, I will call the item. Environment and Natural... Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a basic question here. I'm trying to get a little bit of an understanding on we see in here a couple line items with regard to some new patrol vehicles. Is it possible for the department maybe to just give us a little explanation on how they undertake their fleet management, and describe for us a little bit about, you know, how the life cycle of vehicles is managed by, well, in this instance, by the the Department of VNR, but even in the general context would be appreciated. I'm just trying to understand the degree of the fleets that we use in our departments, and to what extent we are rotating them out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Dr. Dragon.
So various trucks, depending on what they're used for and in what capacity. So we have trucks that go on winter roads and require heavy-duty vehicles. You know, suspensions that are going winter roads, that sort of thing. The items mentioned here in the budget are actually patrol trucks that we replace on a 10-year rotation. If they have to be rotated before then we do. But these trucks typically are all-terrain. They have heavy-duty frames and suspensions. They're typically 3/4-ton vehicles. And then they have the associated winches, light bars, headache racks, and radios. So this is why they're a little bit more expensive, but typically we have them anywhere from 5 to 10 years. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the response. Maybe one of the things that we might include in the future, and I know for sure Mr. Marchiori is very familiar with this line of questioning. In my past position as a city councillor, we often grilled them with regard to our fleet management. But one of the things that would be nice to see maybe is having see somewhere in the budget the department's list of fleet, so that we can kind of get a sense of the lifespan of each one of these kind of vehicles and what kind of rotation they're on, just so that we get a better perspective from a budgetary perspective, I guess, on how we manage our fleet. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if that's the type of information that that committee would like to see as we go before committee debating the capital budget before we get to the floor, maybe we can provide that type of information rather than have it in here. That would be the wish committee. That way they'll have a general idea of the life cycle during the debate of the capital estimates before we bring them on the floor, if that works for committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Seeing nothing further, I will call this item Environment and Natural Resources, Wildlife, Infrastructure Investments, $1,009,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please return to page 16. Environment and Natural Resources, total capital estimates, $2,423,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. This concludes our consideration of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. I want to thank the witnesses. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses from the chamber. Minister, you may take your usual seat. Committee, we have next agreed to consider the Department of Lands, which begins on page 55 of the capital estimates. I will turn to Minister Siebert for any opening comments. Actually, you know what? We're not doing opening comments. I just remembered. So I'll ask Minister Siebert to take his seat at the witness table. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Minister, would you please introduce your witnesses for the record?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. To my left, I have Brenda Hilderman, Director of Finance, and to my right, Willard Hagan, Deputy Minister.
Thank you. Committee, we will defer the departmental total until after consideration of the activity summaries, the first of which is on page 56. Informatics Shared Service Center. First, I have Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the effort that we're putting in with regard to the enterprise licensing and permitting. And we can see here that this is going to be a cross-departmental initiative, and maybe the department can start by explaining a little bit about land's role in particular in this, and is it strictly a lands budget line item, or is all these other departments also contributing to this particular licensing and permitting, this enterprise licensing and permitting? And then also, where will it be centered? If people are to, is this going to be something that's going to be an online thing that's accessible to the public? Is this just interdepartmental improvements, or if we can get some elaboration on this particular line item, it would be appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. And just so everyone's on the same page, it's page 57 that it contains some of the detail that Mr. Van Thyn just referenced. So I will turn to the Minister, Minister Siebert.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This information system project is a collaborative effort between several departments, including Lands, ITI, ENR, and Finance. And the enterprise licensing and permitting system will use common components to enable them to implement business processes. Perhaps with respect to the other portion of the question, I could turn it over to Ms. Hilderman. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Hillerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Informatics Shared Services Center is one of the activities within Lands and provides services, as the Minister mentioned, to ENR, ITI, and Lands. So initially, this information system capital project, which was appropriated originally in our 18-19 capital estimates, and this is for year 2 of the 2-year project. It's a common platform for licenses and permits. Initially, hopefully in this fiscal year, they will implement 10 licenses and permits, and then another 30 within year 2 of the capital project 1920. Once those are in place, it then is a common platform that they will build on that and provide services for other departments to the public through the same common platform. Thank you.
Thank you. And Minister, you'd like to add something?
Yes. Like the whole purpose of this, of course, is to reduce costs of maintaining separate systems across departments, and there was a mention of licenses and permits. There's quite a number of them, from fishing license to pesticide business permits. So hopefully this will lead to a more efficient and less costly system. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the insight with regard to the enterprise licensing and permitting contribution that we're making. Let's just then for a moment jump down for some clarification purposes to land tenure optimization system. It notes that this is to rationalize 5 systems that currently handle the land tenure information and processes, and it's going to create a single platform. Can we get a better understanding of what the 5 systems currently are, and how this single platform will manage these 5 systems? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Minister?
Yeah, the 5 systems that we currently have do have support challenges, and this system will address this risk by providing a common platform that will support several territorial lands, surface, Commissioner's land surface, oil and gas subsurface, the mining recorder's office subsurface, and the forest management division's surface. And hopefully this will be at a lower capital cost, addressing issues of cost, and will be a more efficient and less costly system. And also, I understand, thank you, that it's a mandate item that we will improve collaboration for easier access to the government programs and services online. So this is part of our mandate commitment. 533. Thank you. 533, apparently. And yeah, so this makes sense, quite apart from being a mandate item, makes sense from an economic and user point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Seeing nothing further, I will call this item Lands Informatics Shared Service Center Infrastructure investments, $698,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 58, operations. There's an associated information item on page 59. We'll call the item lands, operations, infrastructure investments, $234,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page, well, there's nothing on planning and coordination, so we will return to page 55 to consider the total. Lands, total capital estimates, $932,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. I want to thank the minister and the witnesses. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses from the chamber. Committee, we have next agreed to consider the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs, found on page 61. I will ask the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs, Minister Moses, to take his seat at the witness table. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Minister Moses, would you please introduce your witness to the House?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Mr. Robert Tordev, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Mackin. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Welcome to the witness. Committee, we will defer consideration of the departmental total until after consideration of the activity summaries, the first of which is on page 64 with an associated information item on page 65. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as the Minister is well aware, the N.W.T. Association of Communities and a number of its members have identified shortfalls year over year as it relates to an undertaking that we took back in 2014 to identify community needs. And I think at the time it was about a $40 million a year shortfall. That was back in 2014. The City of Yellowknife claims to have received an annual shortfall of about $11 million. Of course, the City of Yellowknife is just weeks away from going into its budgetary process, and they're naturally going to raise this issue again, and they're going to point the finger to our government as it relates to not making the commitment to try to lessen this gap. And so, you know, on page 64, this is where we see the contribution. It's $29 million, and it's to all of the communities. And I just want to know from the department if they're doing some work as it relates to lessening the gap. If they are, what is that? If they're not, then what are some of the ways in which we can potentially strive towards overcoming this significant gap? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I did hear the members' comments, all of them that made general comments to the Minister of Finance opening remarks. We do know this is a concern, and I did hear it when I did become Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs when I did sit with the N.W.T.'s Board of Directors or Executive. This year there is a small increase in the funding for O&M as well as, I believe, water and sewer services. And since I think 2014, there has been small incremental increases each year. This funding really is used for core needs of the community, and I know we need to find ways to address that. As you heard with the Minister of Finance, that we try to allocate some of our dollars, and some of the communities actually use some of their CPF funding to try to leverage federal dollars as well. Some of the agreements and federal funding that we are looking for and looking at is obviously the new Building Canada plan, Phase 1, Phase 2 of the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan as well. And so we're looking at opportunities that we can look at closing some of the gaps through trying to leverage some of that federal funding. As we all know, there's been a new elections that just happened, and we are committed to sitting down with the new membership, looking at addressing this by developing a strategy. As members know, during business planning session, I did mention we have put that strategy on hold until the elections were done. Hopefully we should have that strategy in place in the early new year. We will share it with the N.W.T as well as committee then. Through you, Mr. Chair, maybe I can ask my Assistant Deputy Minister if there's any other further information he'd like to share with the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Tordoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In response to the question with respect to what is MACA doing to help address the issue, we have seen an increase in the capital budget that we allocate to communities. In addition to that, we have implemented a number of programs that are designed to help extend the useful life and the time before replacement for much of the community's capital infrastructure, including increased efforts around capital planning and the implementation of a new asset management program.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to be genuine in respecting and appreciating the department's efforts. I think they undertook some really good work with the N.W.T and some community members and what have you back in 2014 when we underwent the evaluation that ultimately identified this gap. I'm convinced, and this is going to be more of a comment, that the government, given the pressures that we have on our budget and the stretched dollars that we have, that we really in fact are never going to be able to overcome this because the demands for capital projects within the communities is, as was mentioned, growing, but then so is the rate of inflation on all of this stuff. So based on what allocations we have available and how all of us in this House realize how tight this budget is year over year, I just don't ever foresee how we're going to remove this infrastructure gap or this funding gap. So it's my belief that the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we, and I'll be raising this in a number of different ways over the next little while, but the territorial financing formula agreement that we have with the federal government has to be renegotiated, and it's with the purview of these kinds of shortfalls in mind that we have to renegotiate that. I don't think that on a per capita basis that we need to request more money, but we certainly need to give consideration to when we generate our own source revenues that it doesn't get clawed back from the other end by the federal government. They need to recognize that these are the kinds of gaps that we need to fill, and that is a process that we have to go through and have a heart-to-heart. And I recognize that TFF, I think, is up for review in 2019. And although the federal government has given early indicators that they're going to maintain status quo, that I would argue that that's not satisfactory, and this is a primary example as to why we have to renegotiate that, or we'll never fulfill this gap. Those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. There were comments. Would the minister care to respond?
No, I appreciate the honesty and the comments made by the member. As I mentioned, one fund that we are looking at is the Investing in Canada Infrastructure program that would help address some of the water and possibly sewage needs for some of our communities. The little increase that we did get in this budget will look at priorities of which municipalities need their infrastructure upgraded. So we're going to be looking at that when this budget passes. But I really appreciate the members' comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, along the same line of the previous member, I am trying to sort out how the whole system works. Is there a situation where, when you're trying to fulfill the capital deficit in the municipalities that have capital deficits, that you're removing money from other communities that are not considered to have a capital deficit? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the easiest answer is no.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio.
So at least, I guess, in communities where we're considered not to have accumulated deficit, the money stays the same. I'm going to take that as the answer no, as meaning that. My question is, when you accumulate a capital deficit, it's based on depreciation. I'm assuming, I'm going to ask the question though, is the capital deficit accumulation based on the depreciation of the assets you have? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Mr. Tordoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The calculation for capital is based on the core needs of infrastructure in a community and the estimated life cycle for that infrastructure.
Thank you. I'll just remind the witness to indicate when you're done talking, with a thank you, just so the tech team knows to change the mics. Mr. Bolio?
Term capital, but I could also say infrastructure. So now, if there's a community such as Yellowknife, which has lots of infrastructure, and there's a depreciation on that infrastructure, then every year, when they replace water lines, I know that there's little depreciation at the first year, but soon as it goes into use, after 1 year, there's a depreciation. So that depreciation would be considered a deficit in the infrastructure. So that's what I'm trying to get at. In the small communities, we have very little infrastructure. A few warehouses here. Most of our roads are gravel. We have no running water. We have water trucks that haul things around and so on. They depreciate as well, but they're very minor items. So if you write a water truck off over 10 years versus trying to write off a water system over 50 years, I think I realize that some of the systems in the city last longer, but Mr. Chair, what I'm trying to get at is we, in some of the small communities, don't appear to have huge infrastructure deficits because we don't have the infrastructure that we need. Like, not all our streets are chip sealed. We don't have piped water systems. We don't have the swimming pools, arenas. We do have some arenas, but not something like certainly what some of the larger centers have. So I've always been concerned about the way infrastructure deficits are accumulated. It looks like the people that have the most have the greatest deficits. So the greatest amount of money goes to the people that have the most infrastructure, and the communities that have very little infrastructure are having very little accumulation of deficit, of appreciation, if I can use that term. It's kind of an oxymoron, but there's an accumulation of deficit to determine the infrastructure deficit. So I'm wondering if the minister has looked into that system that they've employed since 2014 to see if it really is a fair system in determining infrastructure deficits. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister Moses.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And as you heard before, we are developing an asset management program. And when we do look at the deficits, we really do look at the core infrastructure. As I mentioned, a lot of this money goes to core needs for the communities, and we do base it on service life rather than market price at the time. But I think this asset management program that the department has been developing is going to help identify some of that, some things that the members mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. I'm kind of understanding the core as like maybe these are the basic infrastructure that would maintain the city or maintain a town or a hamlet. So maybe I could just get the minister to give me an example of what would not be considered core infrastructure, because I'm seeing infrastructure. I don't see the difference between core infrastructure and infrastructure, period. So I was wondering if maybe I could just get that explanation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yeah, just for clarity, is it what the core needs are in the community or what's outside of it? Just the core needs? Sorry, I missed part of the question there.
Thank you. Some clarification, Mr. Bolio?
When the minister referred to core infrastructure, I was wondering what that included. For me, core infrastructure, all the roads, ditches, dumps, and dogs. No, not dogs, but maybe trucks, heavy equipment, but that's just a clarification on what would be outside of core infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Some of those would include roads, as he mentioned, water, sewage services, solid waste sites. Some of the main things that you'd see in almost any other community. Maybe I'll ask Mr. Tort if there was anything that I might have missed. And you mentioned some other ones earlier, such as other facilities, such as garages for the community for storage and things like that. But maybe through you, Mr. Chair, I'll ask Mr. Tortoff if he has anything further he can add. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Tortoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The minister has provided a pretty good summary of what we would consider core infrastructure. Communities, of course, have the discretion to invest in whichever capital they choose, if they choose to build a swimming pool or so forth. We fund the core infrastructure, and that's structures like roads, water treatment plants, the water delivery truck, that type of equipment is what we would consider core. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand. Maybe swimming pools and things like that I recognize are outside of the core, so I'm beginning to understand what that is. So when the department does infrastructure deficit, then they're looking at the core and they're comparing apples to apples. That's what I want to hear. So that's thank you for the explanation to the minister, and that's all I have for now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Next, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to follow up on the municipal funding gap review that was done jointly between MACA and N.W.T some time ago. One of the commitments in our mandate reads, "We will develop a strategy to close the gap in funding levels to meet municipal core needs." So can the minister tell us when that strategy is going to be ready and made available to the regular MLAs and the public? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as I mentioned, we are looking at working on it again. We put a delay on it since there was an election coming up. I'd say probably the earliest that we might be able to see it, I would say, is in February.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. Look forward to getting the document in February. Can the minister tell us whether the gap itself has been recalculated? Obviously, as we move forward in time, infrastructure changes, cost of living increases and so on. Has the gap, does the department actually recalculate this on a regular basis? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Let's go to Mr. Tardif. Let's go to you.
Mr. Tordoff?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're able to have a good idea of the inventory in the communities through the asset inventory that communities maintain, as well as through their filings with their insurance program. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Okay, that's interesting. But is the gap, the funding gap, actually recalculated on an annual basis? Has it ever been recalculated? Is there a cycle for that? Can someone tell me whether it's actually recalculated? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Tordoff?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe that that'll be a component of the new strategy, the recalculation of the deficit. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So we're going to have a recalculated figure. That figure, can someone tell me how it's actually calculated? Is it, I know there's some sort of an inventory that the department has prepared. Condition of buildings and infrastructure changes over time. Presumably somebody's going to have to go out and look at some of that stuff. Can I get just a bit of a general explanation of how that figure is arrived at? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We don't have that level of detail right now, but we can get that information for the members and committee for future references. And just clarity on talking about the funding gap that we will be bringing out the strategy with in February. It is focused on the O&M budget. I know that a lot of our communities, when they build the infrastructure, the O&M is sometimes the one of the challenges that they have to keep it maintained. But for that specific question for the member, we'll get that information and we'll get it back to the member. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So maybe I'm mistaken here, but I understood that that funding review was done. When it was done, there was part of it was an O&M issue or problem. Part of it was also a capital deficit. So am I hearing then that the minister says that the document we're going to get in February is really only going to deal with the O&M side? It's not going to deal with the capital, the infrastructure deficit? Thanks, Mr. Chair. For our local governments, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The strategy that you'll see before you is going to be dealing is going to be also through the O&M, and we'll also be looking at that in the O&M budget. What we have right now, I know, is all we're talking about capital, and when we recognize the capital, it is on the core need basis. And as I mentioned, we'll one of the ways we're trying to address that is through some of our federal funding agreements to try to offset some of those core need infrastructure in some of the communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, okay. So the document the minister is going to give us is only going to deal with the O&M side. I'll double check myself, but I understood that this gap also was on the capital side, and that's why I'm raising it here. I know some folks don't want us to talk about O&M, but I'm talking about capital. And as I understood, that a municipal funding gap review also had a capital component. So I look forward, if the minister can clarify that when he provides the additional information, that would be much appreciated. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Agreed.
Thank you, Minister. Next I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to just ask questions directly to the capital side. The O&M is coming up here, but I think I brought this up here last year as well on your supply management inventory requirements. If you use the water treatment plant there in some of the communities, I'm hoping that, you know, if it's being supplied by this company called Cortex. So if it is in fact in the contribution agreement between the department and the local government, encouraging them to deal strictly with similar suppliers and making it a lot easier to interact and supply and support each other on, say, filters, for example, for the water plant. If Delaney runs out, well, then they can borrow from other neighboring communities. Those kind of factors come into play when you have one supply chain management for the same product, and economies of scale come into factor as well. Just being more mindful of efficiency on the expenditure side of the capital that's being built in these communities. And then also that's more of a comment that I brought out last year. I'll bring that out again. And in my next comment, I agree with the member from the Yellowknife North on having arguments for our depreciated infrastructure in preparation for the next round of TFF negotiations to see if there's substantial arguments to get our gap filled with increased contributions coming from our banker, the federal government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to the member's first comment there, when it comes to, I guess, like some of the, the O&M materials, we do go by standard design, and we work with the N.W.T. And when we look at it, purchasing, we do group purchases so that it's available should something happen. And I take the members' comments that when we are looking at negotiating with the federal government, that we do take everything into consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next I have Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I guess the first comment is about the glossary, and we talk about core. Could we, in the future, just get that put in there into the appendix so that we have a clear understanding of what core is when it comes to municipal governments? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister Moses?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and we can put something in there, a definition of what the core needs are and how we use it to look at doing our funding to the communities and some of the questions that have already been asked. And yeah, we could definitely do that.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the Minister for providing that. Next question is, how much money are we receiving from the Canada Build Canada Fund, and which is going to the communities? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have that detail. I can provide it though to the member, but it is increased funding, and it's addressing some of the core needs that I'd mentioned earlier, the roads, solid waste, those kind of things. And I'll get that information for the member. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if the Minister can just get it to PNP so the group can understand that, that would be very grateful and helpful. The member from Tulladay-Welladay talked about asset management there, and I heard that, talked about the core. So how, with the core, does office buildings be part of the core, or is that just some subset or something else? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And we will get a definition of all the core infrastructure in the communities. We'll share it with members, and I do believe that office buildings are part of that core as well.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the Minister clarifying that and looking for that information. I guess my next question, though, I do have is, if municipalities decide to, build rec facilities, pools, libraries, does the government put funding towards those type of projects? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The municipalities get separate O&M funding, and they're free to use that for any special projects that they want to do outside of what the core needs are. And that's really up to the municipalities when they go through their capital budgets. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can the Minister advise, is this part of the gas tax that they receive, or is this, because when we talk O&M, that's O&M, operation, maintenance of the facility, so I'm trying to better understand this. Yeah, better understand it. So if the Minister can clarify exactly that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And some of that is the CPI funding that they do receive, as well as the gas tax, so they can use either or to look at any kind of special projects that they do. But our main focus is to have those core needs in place: the water, the sewage, the solid waste, for the health, wellness, and safety of our residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, and I appreciate the Minister's answers for that. Can the Minister explain why, when they talk about, safety or in health of the community, that recreation facilities would not be one of the core? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the presentation that we had given to committee a while back, I know that there are some possible federal funding that we can utilize. As we bring that definition forward, we will see. I can't say right now if it is a core need, but I will look into that and I'll get back to the member.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
That'd be all, and I'd like to thank the Minister and the witness for providing information here today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Nothing further from committee. I will call the activity: Municipal and Community Affairs, Regional Operations, Infrastructure Investments, $29 million. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 61. Municipal and Community Affairs, total capital estimates, $29 million. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Committee, do you agree that we have concluded our consideration of the Department of Municipal Community Affairs, the Department of Lands, and the Department of Environment and Natural Resources? Thank you, committee. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witness from the chamber. Thank you to the witness for appearing before us. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There's a motion to report progress. The motion's in order, non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress. Thank you, committee.
May I have the report, member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 215-18(3) capital estimates 2019-2020 and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Yellowknife North. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Must see. Third reading of bills. Oh. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Yellowknife South, that Bill 27, Supplementary Appropriation Act Infrastructure Expenditures Number 3, 2018-2019, be read for the third time. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hussey. Member requested for a recorded vote. Motions in order to the question. Oh, sorry. Question's been called. All those in favor, please stand.
The member for Nunavut Twin Lakes, the member for Tabacha, the member for Hay River North, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Tunada-Welladay, the member for Nahende, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Yellowknife Center, the member for Nunakput, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Yellowknife South.
All those opposed, please stand. All those abstain, please stand.
One more.
The results of the recorded vote, 13 in favor, 0 against, 0 abstention. Motion carried. Bill 27 has had a third reading. Third reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I move, second by the Honourable Member for Tabacha, that Bill 28, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures, Number 3, 2018-2019, be read for the third time. And, Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hussey. Member requested for a recorded vote. Motions in order to the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor, please stand.
The member for Nunavut Twin Lakes, the member for Tabacha, the member for Hay River North, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Tunada-Welladay, the member for Nahende, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Yellowknife Center, the member for Nunakput, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, and the member for Yellowknife South.
All those opposed, please stand. All those abstain, please stand. The results of the recorded vote, 14 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. Motion carried. Third reading of bills. Bill 28 has had a third reading. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Friday, October 26, 2018, 10 a.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, Bills 25 and 26, second reading of bills, Bill 24, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 19-18.3, Minister Statement 103-18.3, Table Document 215-18.3, Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Friday, October 26, 10 a.m.
Order.